They called him the Moretti King, and they whispered it like a prayer no one dared say out loud. Elena Whitmore had 30 seconds to live. She knew this the way she knew a flatline, not as a concept, not as a fear, but as a fact arriving in her body before her brain could argue against it. 3 men stood in her mother's kitchen. One held a blade. One held a phone recording everything. The third held her mother by the collar of her hospital gown, the IV line still trailing from the back of her hand, the tape holding it in place starting to peel at the edges. 30 seconds. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end. You will not want to miss what comes next. The night it started, Elena was running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and regret. 12-hour ER shift at Mercy General, a double code at 3 a.m., a pediatric trauma that she was still carrying somewhere behind her sternum when she finally punched out at 7. She drove home on autopilot, red lights, lane changes, a toll booth she barely registered, and pulled into the parking space outside her mother's apartment building on the south side of Chicago just as the sun started bleeding orange across the rooftops. She was not supposed to be here. She had her own place, a studio 4 miles away with a broken radiator and a landlord who left passive-aggressive notes about the recycling. But her mother, Carol Whitmore, had been sick for 9 months. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, chewing through her body the way rust chews through metal, and Elena had fallen into the habit of stopping by before sleep, checking the pill organizer, making sure the fridge had something in it that wasn't expired. She had a key. She used it. The apartment smelled wrong before she even got through the foyer. Not wrong like something had spoiled. Wrong like adrenaline. Like sweat that came from fear rather than heat. Elena's ER instincts fired before her conscious mind caught up. Something in the air pressure, the stillness, the absence of the small sounds Carol always made. The television murmuring, the kettle ticking as it cooled. She pushed into the kitchen. 3 men, 1 table, her mother in a chair she hadn't walked to herself. Carol Whitmore looked like she'd been sitting there for a while. Her hospital gown, the one Elena had helped her put on 2 days ago after the chemo infusion, was pulled askew at the shoulder. Her hands were folded in her lap, too deliberately, the way hands get when someone has been told to keep them still or else. The IV port on the back of her left hand was still taped in place, the clear tubing dangling, unconnected, like a leash with nothing at the end of it. Her eyes found Elena's across the kitchen and said one thing: run. Elena didn't run. The man with the blade was the youngest of the 3, maybe 22, with a jaw like a cinder block and a scar that split his left eyebrow. He wasn't pointing it at anyone, he was just holding it, resting the flat of it against his thigh, which was somehow worse than if he'd been threatening someone directly. Casual violence was always more terrifying than performed violence. Elena had learned that working the ER, the patients who came in screaming were usually okay. The ones who came in quiet, who sat in triage without making a sound, were the ones you needed to move fast for. The man with the phone was recording. No expression, just documentation. The third man, the oldest, mid-50s, with silver at his temples and a tailored jacket that was entirely wrong for a South Side apartment kitchen, sat across from Carol with his hands laced together on the table. He looked at Elena the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, clinical, assessing. "You're the daughter," he said. Not a question. Elena's hand was still on the door handle. She calculated the distance between herself and her mother. 8 feet, maybe 9. The young man with the blade was between them, positioned at the counter, and she knew without testing it that he could close that distance faster than she could. "Whatever she owes you," Elena said, "I'll pay it." She didn't know how. She had $1,100 in checking and a credit card she'd already pushed past its limit covering Carol's co-pays. But she said it because it was the right thing to say. Buy time, establish a negotiating position, keep them talking. The man with the silver temples smiled. It didn't reach anything above his upper lip. "Your mother borrowed $420,000, he said, "over 18 months. Small installments at first, then larger ones. Then she stopped paying." He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. We don't do renegotiation. We don't do payment plans. We do collection. For cancer treatment, Elena said. The words came out harder than she intended. She was paying for treatment because her insurance capped out. I'm aware of why she borrowed the money. His voice didn't change. I'm not her physician. I'm her creditor. The reason is irrelevant. Carol made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound that meant she was trying to hold herself together and not quite managing. Elena looked at her mother. Really looked. The way she'd been avoiding doing for months, because looking too directly at Carol's face lately felt like staring into something she wasn't ready to name. Carol had lost weight she didn't have to lose. Her cheekbones pressed against her skin. Her eyes were the same dark brown they'd always been, but something behind them had gone thin, like a light source losing wattage. She was 56 years old and she looked 70. She had borrowed $420,000 from criminals to keep herself alive, and she had not told Elena. Not one word. 18 months of secrets, small installments, larger ones, and then the silence that comes when the numbers stop adding up and the fear takes over. Get away from her, Elena said. The young man with the blade tilted his head, curious, like she'd said something in a language he was still translating. Elena, her mother's voice, thin and careful. Don't. Mrs. Whitmore, the man with silver temples said, without looking away from Elena. Your daughter seems to misunderstand her position here. Perhaps you could explain it to her. She doesn't need to explain anything. Elena stepped fully into the kitchen, letting the door fall shut behind her. I'm a registered nurse. I have a professional license and a name in this city's medical system. If anything happens to either of us, there is a documented trail leading directly to this apartment at this time. It was a bluff, a partial one. She had texted nobody. Her phone was in her jacket pocket, and her jacket was on a hook by the door. The man with silver temples studied her for a moment. Then he said, Mikhail. The young man peeled himself off the counter. Elena felt her body go very still. The stillness that happened when the conscious mind stepped back and something older and less rational took over. And she was calculating exits, angles, the weight of the cast iron skillet on the stovetop to her left, how quickly she could get between Mikhail and her mother, what it would cost, whether the cost was something she could survive. The sound came from outside before Mikhail took a second step. Not a sound exactly. A pressure change. The kind of thing you feel in your back teeth before you understand what it is. Then headlights cut across the kitchen window. Not one set, multiple sets, a convoy. And then tires on pavement, doors opening in sequence. The specific organized silence of people who move in formation because they've spent years learning how. Mikhail stopped. The man with silver temples turned his head toward the window. For the first time, the clinical assessment in his face cracked. Not much, a millimeter. But Elena had spent years reading vital signs, and she saw it. The involuntary constriction, the jaw that tightened, the very small recalibration of someone who had walked into a situation expecting to be the most dangerous thing in it and was no longer certain. Someone knocked on the apartment door. 3 knocks. Measured, unhurried. Nobody moved. The knock came again. Open it, said a voice from the other side. The voice was quiet, not raised, not theatrical. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a voice that had spent so long being obeyed that it had stopped needing to perform authority. It simply carried it the way a blade carries its edge without trying. Mikhail looked at Silver Temples. Silver Temples looked at the door. Elena opened it. The man on the other side was tall, not enormous, but built in a way that suggested everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was precisely calculated. Dark coat, charcoal gray, cut well. Dark eyes that moved across the kitchen in less than a second, cataloging everything without appearing to hurry. A jaw that looked like it had been carved from something that didn't give. Mid-30s, maybe, though the way he held himself put him outside the normal brackets for age. He looked like someone who had stopped counting years because the number had become irrelevant. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him in the hallway, and beyond them Elena could see the stairwell was no longer empty. He stepped into the kitchen. Silver Temples stood up from the table. Mr. Moretti. Sit down, Carver. Carver sat down. Lucian Moretti didn't look at Elena. Not yet. He walked to the center of the kitchen, stood with his hands at his sides, and looked at Carol Whitmore the way Elena herself looked at patients, taking inventory, deciding what was urgent, filing everything else for later. "You're the mother," he said. Carol's chin lifted slightly. Even now, even in a hospital gown with an IV port in her hand and 3 strangers in her kitchen, Carol Whitmore had a specific kind of stubbornness that decades of difficulty had only compressed rather than extinguished. "I'm the woman who owns this apartment," she said, "and none of you have been invited." Something moved at the corner of Moretti's mouth. Not a smile, the ghost of one. He turned to Carver. "What does she owe?" 420, round number. Carver paused. 450, including accrued. Zeroed, Lucian said. Silence. Carver's face did something complicated. "Mr. Moretti, the Belanov network doesn't... The Belanov network," Lucian said, "operates in this city at my sufferance. You have been reminded of this previously." He let that land. Then, "The debt is zeroed? The Whitmore account is closed. You'll confirm this to the network tonight, and you'll leave this apartment without touching anything on your way out." Mikhail was already moving. Something had happened to his posture. The casual readiness had gone out of him, replaced by something that wanted to be somewhere else very badly. Carver stood more slowly. His eyes moved to Elena, and there was something in them she didn't like. A notation, a filing away, before he straightened his jacket and walked out. Mikhail followed. The man with the phone followed last, and Elena had the specific crawling thought that whatever he'd recorded was now in a system somewhere and would not disappear just because the men had left the room. Then they were gone. Carol exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that had been held for longer than one evening. Elena crossed to her and checked the IV port automatically, running her fingers along the tape, looking at the entry site. "This is still usable," she said, her voice coming out clinical because clinical was the register she trusted. "We need to get it flushed. Do you have supplies?" "Elena," Carol caught her hand. "Baby." "Don't." The word came out harder than she meant. She turned away, pressing her fingers to the bridge of her nose. 18 months, $420,000, not one word. She loved her mother with the particular, exhausting, bone-deep love of a person who had been raised alone by one parent and understood what that parent had sacrificed, which made the silence feel like an amputation. "I didn't want you to." "I know what you didn't want." She turned back. Her voice was steadier now. "We'll talk about it, just not yet." She became aware that Lucien Moretti was still in the kitchen. He was standing near the window, looking out at the street where his vehicles had pulled up. He'd given her mother and her a moment, which was either consideration or tactic or both, and she couldn't sort it yet. She crossed to him. "Why?" Elena said. He looked at her. Up close, his eyes were darker than she'd registered from across the room. Not soft, but not empty either. Something moved in them that she didn't have a name for yet. "The Belanov network has been operating in this district for 11 months without authorization," he said. This was a necessary correction. "You didn't do this for correction." A pause. "No." "Then why?" He studied her for a moment with the thoroughness of someone reading a document. "Your father," he said, "was Robert Whitmore." Elena's chest did something irregular. "My father has been dead for 15 years. "I know." She waited. "We'll discuss it," Lucien said. "When you're ready to discuss it. Tonight you should get your mother settled. Tomorrow." He reached into his coat and produced a card. Not a business card with a title and phone number. Just a card with an address in clean, unadorned type. "Tomorrow, come to this address, 10 o'clock. "And if I don't?" He looked at her steadily. "Then Carver's network will rebuild the debt within 72 hours, because that's what they do. And your mother will receive a visit from people I won't have sanctioned and therefore won't be able to call off. That's not a threat." His voice carried the same unperformed quality as when she'd heard it through the door. It's an accurate description of how these organizations operate when a balance sheet is disputed. Elena took the card. You haven't told me what you want, she said. I'll tell you tomorrow, Lucian said. At 10 o'clock. He left. His men moved with him in that same organized silence, and within 45 seconds the hallway was empty and the apartment was just an apartment again, slightly too small and smelling of the lavender Carol used in her laundry, the refrigerator humming. Carol said, from the table, Elena. I know, Mom. He's not what people say I don't know what people say he is. Elena sat down across from her mother. She put the card on the table between them, face down. Start from the beginning, all of it, every amount, every date, every person you dealt with. I need to know what I'm walking into. Carol looked at the card, then at Elena. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't look away. You're going to go, Carol said. Not a question. I'm a nurse, Elena said. I go where the damage is. She turned the card over. The address was downtown, near the river. Outside, the morning had broken fully now, pale gray light spreading across the rooftops, the city grinding into its daily machinery of noise and motion, and people who didn't know that in a kitchen on the south side, the last 3 hours had rearranged the next year of Elena Whitmore's life. She stayed with her mother until Carol fell asleep, which took 2 hours and 3 cups of tea and most of Carol's energy. She watched her breathing. She always watched people's breathing. It was the first thing and the last thing, the only vital sign that told you everything. Carol's was shallow but even, and Elena watched it until she was sure. Then she went to the window. She turned the card over in her fingers. Robert Whitmore had been an accountant. That was what she had always been told. A mild, precise, careful man who loved crossword puzzles and terrible puns, and who had walked out one morning to go to work and never come home. And the official version was a car accident on Route 41, single vehicle, ice on the road. She had been 10 years old. She had never stopped wondering why the casket had been closed. She put the card in her jacket pocket and looked out at the city. Somewhere to the north, where the river bent and the high-rises caught the early light, was an address and a man who knew her father's name and had just erased $400,000 in debt without blinking. She already knew she was going to go. What she didn't know, what kept her standing at the window while her mother slept and the city woke around them, was what it was going to cost. The address on the card was a building that didn't announce itself. That was the first thing she noticed when she arrived the next morning at 9:58. No signage, no lobby directory. 40 stories of steel and glass in the financial district that looked from the outside like it could be anything, law firms, investment funds, the kind of money that didn't need to explain itself. The doorman saw her coming and opened the door before she reached it, which meant she'd been expected, which meant she'd been watched on the way in, which she'd half anticipated and still found unpleasant. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse floor where the walls were glass on 3 sides, and the city spread out below like a circuit board seen from altitude. A woman Elena's age met her, dark hair, precise posture, the kind of professional blankness that was itself a form of expression, and led her without a word through a hallway lined with nothing, no art, no decoration, just clean lines and controlled light, to a room that was almost entirely window. Lucian Moretti was standing at the glass. In daylight, in this space, he looked different than he had in her mother's kitchen. He looked exactly like what he was. She tried to hold on to the clinical detachment that had served her through the night, the same register she used for difficult conversations in the ER, and found it available but thin. "You came," he said, still not performing anything, just stating it. "You left me a specific and accurate description of the consequences of not coming," Elena said. He turned. The morning light from the east windows made shadows of his features. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself." He moved to the center of the room, large, sparse, with a single table and 2 chairs and nothing on the table. And he did sit, which shifted the dynamic in a way she hadn't expected. Sitting while she stood. "I want you to understand something before I explain what I'm proposing," he said. "You're not being coerced." "My mother's debt is technically still intact unless I cooperate," Elena said. "That's a fairly common definition of coercion." Her debt is zeroed regardless, he said. That happened last night. The Belanov network received confirmation at 11 p.m. The debt is gone whether you walk out of here in 5 minutes or stay and hear the rest. Elena processed this. Then why am I here? He folded his hands on the table. Because I need a wife. The room felt different for a half second. Then Elena's brain reclassified and reassembled the sentence, and she said, Excuse me? A legal marriage, 1 year. You would reside in my home, appear at functions, be present at occasions where a spouse is structurally necessary. You would be protected. Your mother would receive legitimate medical care through a private oncology practice that is entirely above board, no strings attached. The cancer treatment she has been receiving, which is currently effective but unstable in its sourcing, it would be stabilized, documented, supported. Elena looked at him. You need a wife for structural reasons. There is a negotiation occurring, he said, between several families whose cooperation is essential to a long-term transition I am engineering within my organization. These families operate according to specific social architectures. A married man who has visibly, publicly chosen a partner communicates something about stability and permanence that my current position does not. It's a signal. You would be a signal. I would be a prop. You would be a well-compensated, protected, medically supported partner in a legal arrangement that lasts 12 months, after which you receive a settlement, a clean exit, and no further obligations. Elena looked out the window. The city was doing what it always did, moving, grinding, indifferent. 40 stories below, people were going to their jobs and their arguments and their small emergencies, and none of them were standing in a glass room being offered a marriage contract by a man whose name made hardened criminals sit down without being asked. You said my father's name last night, she said. A beat. Robert Whitmore, Lucian said. Yes. You said it like it meant something to you. It does. What? He looked at her steadily. That's a longer conversation. One that's relevant, but one I'd prefer to have once we have a clearer understanding of your position. My position. She turned back to him. Tell me what you know about my father. I will, he said. After. That's not how trust works. No, he agreed. It isn't. But trust takes time, and we don't have the luxury of establishing it conventionally. I'm offering you a structure instead, a contract. Rules you can read, terms you can examine, obligations that are explicit and bounded. He paused. I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs. Elena studied him. She was good at reading people. So it was the most transferable skill from 12 years in emergency medicine, the ability to read past what someone was presenting and see what was actually happening underneath. Lucienne Moretti was contained in a way that suggested practice rather than nature, which meant somewhere under the containment there was something less controlled, and she filed that away. He was not, she thought, lying. She wasn't sure that made it better. I want to see the contract, she said. A physical document, every term, every obligation, every exit clause. He nodded, reached to the side of his chair and produced a document that had clearly been prepared in advance, which told her this meeting had been mapped out long before she'd walked in, which told her things about how he operated. She took it, sat down across from him, choosing now, since it was her choice, and read. It took 40 minutes. She read every page twice. He sat across from her and waited without speaking, without checking his phone, without performing patience. He just waited the way experienced people wait, which is to say without any particular relationship to the time passing. The contract was precise. 1 year, beginning from the date of signing. Residency in the Moretti estate in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Public appearances as required with minimum notice of 48 hours. No disclosure of the contract's nature or terms to third parties. Her mother's medical arrangement was appendixed and detailed with a specific named physician and an independent trust that would fund the care regardless of the marriage's status. She read that clause 3 times. The exit clause was clause 22. Clean departure at the 12-month mark, no extensions without mutual written consent, a financial settlement specified in an amount that made her stop reading for a moment and restart. She looked up. This is a large number, she said, pointing to clause 22's settlement figure. You'll earn it, he said. Not boastful, not salesman-like, just matter-of-fact, and the matter-of-factness of it made the hair on her arms rise slightly because it suggested he knew things about the next 12 months that she didn't. She put the document on the table. "I need 48 hours, she said. "You have 24, he said. "I'm sorry, the timeline is constrained." She nodded, stood, picked up the contract. "The thing about my father," she said, "if I sign this, you tell me everything." "Yes," Lucien said. "Everything means everything. Not what you decide I need to know. Everything." He held her gaze. "Yes." She walked to the elevator. At the threshold, she stopped, not turning around. "If anything happens to my mother while I'm deciding," she said, "we're done before we start." "Nothing will happen to your mother," he said. "She was under my protection from the moment I pulled up outside her building last night." Elena stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She rode down 40 stories with the contract against her chest and the image of her mother's face in the kitchen and the question she'd been carrying for 15 years. Why the casket had been closed. Why a man who drove that road every day lost control on a dry Wednesday morning in October. Why her mother had never really answered when Elena asked. And somewhere in the space between the 40th floor and the lobby, she understood that she had already made the decision. She just hadn't signed the paper yet. 23 hours later, she did. She stood in the same room, in the same pale morning light, and she put her name on the line at the bottom of Clause 31 and handed the pen back across the table without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the signature hadn't already said. Lucien signed below her. His handwriting was exact and compact, which surprised her. She'd expected something more expansive from a man who owned 40 floors of glass above the Chicago River. The woman with the precise posture collected the document. 2 copies, one for each of them. The original went somewhere Elena couldn't see. "You move in Saturday," Lucien said. "I know," Elena said. She'd read Clause 4. "I need to arrange care coverage for my mother." "It's arranged," he said. "There's a nurse, a legitimate home health service, credentialed, background checked. She starts tomorrow morning." Elena looked at him. "You arranged that before I signed." "I arranged it before you came here yesterday," he said, "in case you signed." "And if I hadn't signed? The nurse would still have started," he said. "The care arrangement is separate from the contract. I told you. The debt was zeroed regardless." She stood there for a moment with that. "You could have led with that," she said. "I know," he said. "You needed to feel the stakes." Elena felt a specific sharp anger at this, at being managed, at having the information withheld as a deliberate tactic. And she let herself feel it clearly because she wanted to know what she was dealing with. He was someone who controlled information, who shaped situations, who had mapped this meeting down to the emotional arc. She filed it. She would need to remember it. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday." She turned to go, and then she stopped again. And this time she turned back. "My father," she said. "You promised everything." "I know what I promised," Lucien said. There was something in his face she still didn't have a name for. Not quite heavy, not quite reluctant, but carrying something. "When you're settled. When you understand enough about what you've walked into to make sense of what I tell you. A week, maybe 2. Elena held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she left. She didn't look down at the city this time. She looked forward, at the elevator doors, at the hallway, at the exit. She was good at forward. It was backward she'd never been able to figure out. The 15 years of backward that started with a closed casket on a dry October morning. Maybe now she was going to find out why. Saturday came the way hard things come. Too fast and then all at once. Elena packed 2 bags. She left most of her things in the studio. Something in her resisted packing everything, like a part of her brain was maintaining the option of return, even though she knew she'd signed it away for 12 months. The car that arrived for her was black and large and had tinted windows. The driver didn't speak. She sat in the back with her 2 bags and watched Chicago move past the glass. Her Chicago, the South Side and the highway and the neighborhood she'd driven through for years. Until it became the North Side, became Lincoln Park, became a tree-lined street where the houses had iron gates and the setbacks from the road were long enough to matter. The Moretti estate was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined something that announced itself, all columns and architecture, a building that wanted you to know what it was. It was quieter than that, larger than it looked from the gate. Stone, not new, with windows that had the specific weight of old glass. Gardens that were still bare from winter. A front door that was heavy enough that you understood, when it opened, that it was built to be a barrier. A man opened the door. 60s, gray, with a face that had been weathered into dignity. He introduced himself as Renato. He carried one of her bags. He showed her to a room on the third floor that was larger than her entire studio and had a window that looked east over the gardens. "Mr. Moretti is not in the house tonight," Renato said. "He'll be back tomorrow morning. Dinner is at 7. You're welcome to take it in your room or in the dining room." "My room," Elena said. "Of course." He left. She sat on the edge of the bed. Enormous, white linen, the kind of bed that would take some getting used to. And she looked at the room and she thought about her mother's face in the kitchen, and the IV port hanging loose, and the way Carver had looked at her when he left, the notation, the filing away. Her phone showed a text from Carol. "The nurse is very kind. The fridge is full. Stop worrying about me." Elena texted back, "Impossible. I'm a nurse. Worrying is the job." She sat for a while in the quiet. It was a different quiet from her studio, deeper, older, with more rooms behind it. A house quiet rather than an apartment quiet. Then she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Not Renato's. She'd already memorized Renato's deliberate, even gait. These were faster, and voices, low, terse. 2 of them, maybe 3, somewhere down the hall. And she couldn't make out the words, but she could make out the register. Tense, pressured, the particular pitch of people who are dealing with something they hadn't anticipated. She moved to the door. Cracked it. Down the hall, 20 feet away, 2 men she hadn't seen before were talking. Dark clothes, not the suits Lucian's people wore. And between them, barely visible past their shoulders, a face. A man she recognized. Carver. Silver temples. Tailored jacket. Standing in Lucian Moretti's hallway on the first night of her residence, speaking to people who were dressed wrong and moving wrong and who did not look like they were there with authorization. Elena eased the door shut. Her heart was doing the thing it did in a trauma bay right before a situation degraded. Not racing, exactly, but sharpening, everything narrowing to the present moment. She looked at her phone. She looked at the door. She looked at the window, at the dark gardens below, at the gate and the street beyond it. She thought about Clause 22, the exit clause, the clean departure at the 12-month mark. Then she thought about what Carver had filed away when he looked at her in her mother's kitchen. And she understood, in the specific, cold water clarity that came from years of working emergencies, that the contract she'd signed was not going to be the most dangerous thing in this house. The most dangerous thing was whatever Carver was doing in this hallway on a night when Lucian wasn't home. And she was the only person who'd seen him. The man in the parking garage made his call at 6:51 in the morning and was gone before the first shift change cars started filling the lower levels. Elena didn't know about him. She was already on the expressway, one hand on the wheel, Noah asleep in the passenger seat with his head against the glass. And she was running the numbers the way she always ran numbers when something threatened the structure. What she knew, what she didn't know, what the gap between those 2 things was likely to cost her. What she knew. Dorian Viscari had been shot and brought to Mercy General. He had seen her. He had seen Noah. He had done the math and arrived at the right answer and said, "I know what I'm looking for," with the particular quiet certainty of a man who had spent 10 years building an empire on exactly that kind of certainty. What she didn't know, who had put the bullet in him, whether it was connected to what she knew from 10 years ago, whether the people who had handed her that manila envelope in a parking structure, people who had been inside the Viscari organization, high enough to know the timeline, high enough to know her name, were still there, still operational, still patient. The gap between those 2 things was the size of her son's entire life. She got Noah home, got him through the door, shoes off, back into bed with the specific boneless efficiency of a sleeping child who could be moved without fully waking. Pulled the blanket up. Stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him, his dark hair across the pillow, his hand curled near his face. Then she went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. Behind the cereal boxes and the spare batteries and the takeout menus she never looked at, there was a manila envelope. Not the original. The original had been burned 11 days after she'd left because she hadn't trusted herself to keep it and hadn't trusted anyone else to destroy it properly. But she'd spent the 3 weeks before she ran making copies of everything she could copy, photographing what she couldn't, writing down by hand what she couldn't photograph. Names, dates, amounts, the specific language of internal communications between 3 men who had sat at the table with Dorian Viscari for years and had decided, quietly, efficiently, that the table needed fewer people on it. She'd kept it because she'd thought 10 years ago that she might need it, that there might come a day when running wasn't enough. She'd thought about destroying it at least 40 times since then. Every time she moved, every time Noah asked about his father on his birthday, every time she looked at him and saw Dorian's eyes looking back at her, and felt the specific weight of a choice she could neither take back nor fully justify. She put the envelope on the kitchen table, poured her tea, sat down. She didn't open it. She knew what was inside. She was thinking about the man with the silver hair, Rafe, she'd heard one of the others call him, the name landing somewhere in her memory like a coin in deep water, and the way he'd looked at Noah, evaluating, precise, not hostile, something more careful than that. She was thinking about Dorian saying, "I've done it before, and I'll do it again." She was thinking about the 4 men in the waiting room and the one thing Patrice had said before she'd left. His people are being difficult. She thought, how many people know where I work? She thought, how many people knew where Dorian was going to be last night? She thought, the same answer. She drank her tea. Let the morning come in through the window above the sink, pale and colorless, the city outside waking up without any sense of what it owed her. Then she got up, put the envelope back where it lived, and went to change her clothes before Noah's alarm went off. She had a diner shift in 3 hours. Life didn't pause for revelation. Dorian was out of the trauma room by 9 a.m. They'd moved him to a private room on the 4th floor, which Rafe had arranged with the particular efficiency of a man who had learned that money converted most problems into logistics. The room was at the end of a corridor that had 2 entry points and 1 service exit. Rafe had a man at each one. Not visibly. That would have drawn the wrong kind of attention. But present. The doctor came in at 9:15, explained the damage in clinical terms. The bullet had nicked the outer edge of the right lobe of the liver, missed anything critical by less than a centimeter. And if they'd been another 20 minutes getting him to the table, the math would have been different. He'd need 2 weeks of limited mobility. He'd need follow-up imaging. He'd need to take this seriously. Dorian listened to all of it with the focused patience of a man who was already thinking about something else. When the doctor left, Rafe closed the door. "Tell me," Dorian said. Rafe sat down in the chair beside the bed, the same chair he'd sat in at 6 in the morning, and opened the folder he'd been building since he'd sent that text 4 hours ago. He had people. Not many, but the right kind. The kind who understood that thoroughness was a form of loyalty. And 4 hours was enough time when you knew where to look. The shooter was from the Calaran network, not Calaran himself, one of the outer contractors they've used twice in the last 18 months. He's in the wind. The vehicle was stolen from a long-term lot near the airport, plates from a different state, wiped clean before abandonment. He paused. That's professional. That's not Calaran's usual work. Calaran doesn't hire that clean, Dorian said. No, which means someone hired through him or used his network as a blind. Someone who knew that if we traced it, we'd look at Calaran first and spend time there. Misdirection. Yes. Someone inside. Rafe didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Dorian looked at the window. Gray morning, the city laid out below in the particular mundane indifference of 8 million people who had nothing to do with any of this. How many people knew my route last night? The route was set 2 hours before departure. 4 people knew it. Myself, Marco, Devereaux, and Lena in dispatch. Marco's been with me 12 years. Yes. Devereaux? 8, and he was in the vehicle. He took a graze on the left shoulder. Rafe's voice was neutral. He's been treated. He's downstairs. Dorian was quiet. Lena. I'm looking. How long has she been in dispatch? 14 months. She was brought on by... Rafe stopped. By who? Rafe looked at him steadily.
by Cassius Ferme. The name sat in the room like smoke. Cassius Ferme had been a senior figure in the Viscari organization for 15 years. He was 61 now, ran the financial operations from a waterfront office building that looked from the outside like an import consultancy, which it partly was. He was the kind of man who smiled at weddings and christenings and charity events and kept ledgers that would take a forensic accountant 2 years to fully unpick. He'd been at the table when Dorian's father died. He'd been at the table when Dorian took over.
He had never, in 15 years, given Dorian a single clear reason to doubt him. Dorian had doubted him for 11 of those 15 years, with the specific instinct of a man who had learned to trust his own discomfort above his own evidence. He just hadn't acted on it because instinct without evidence was just noise, and noise was dangerous. "Pull everything on Ferme," he said, quietly. "Nothing that touches the main operation. Use Carver." "Carver's expensive." "I just had liver surgery. I'm past caring about expense." Rafe nodded, made a note. Then he looked at the folder in his hands and something shifted in his face. The smallest possible shift, but Dorian had been reading Rafe's face for 11 years. "What else?" Dorian said. "The intake clerk at the hospital." He said it carefully. "Elena Mercer. I pulled her history this morning." Dorian was very still. "And?" "She's been here for 6 years. Before that, Denton City for 2 years. Before that, Caswell for 18 months. Before that, she's harder to trace. A gap of about 8 months where the paper record is thin, then a reappearance in the system in a city she hadn't previously lived in with a slightly different professional history than what she had before." He paused. "The kind of gap that happens when someone is actively trying to not be found." "She was running." "Yes, from what I don't have yet. But the timeline—" Rafe looked at him. "She disappeared 10 years ago, Dorian. The gap starts 10 years ago." "The same time?" "Yes," Dorian breathed, carefully, because his side protested anything faster than careful. "She didn't run from me." "I don't know that yet." "I do." He said it flat, no room in it for debate. "She ran from something. She made sure I'd stop looking. Those are 2 different things." He looked at the ceiling. "Someone told her something, 10 years ago. Something about me, about what was coming. And she ran instead of coming to me." "Why would she not come to you?" "Because whatever she was told made coming to me the dangerous option." His jaw tightened. "Which means whoever told her presented it that way. Framed it so that the only safe move looked like disappearing." Rafe was quiet for a moment. "Cassius Ferme was operational 10 years ago." The sentence didn't need a response. Both of them let it sit in the room and do its work. Then Dorian said, "The boy." Rafe closed the folder. "Yes. He's mine." "I know." She raised him alone. 3 jobs. He'd processed the intake form from across the room, had read it upside down because he'd learned to read upside down at 22, a useful skill that had never stopped being useful. Emergency clerk, but before that a diner and a cleaning service at least. The hands. He stopped. She looked like someone who hadn't slept a full night in years. Rafe said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "I want to know everything about her situation," Dorian said. "Not surveillance, not leverage. I want to know what she needs and whether there's a threat I'm not seeing yet. There may already be one." "I know, the man in Bay C." Rafe had told him about the camera footage, the partial plate, the positioning, the phone call. "He was there before the ambulance. He was waiting." "For you? Or for her?" Dorian looked at him. "If someone inside my organization has been operational for 10 years, if the same people who tried to remove me then are the same people who tried last night, they know about Elena. They've known about her as long as I've been looking for her, which means they've been watching her too, waiting to see if she'd surface. And now she has, because I surfaced in her hospital." His voice went flat with something dark. "I brought this to her door. You didn't know? Doesn't matter." He pushed himself up slightly, winced, pressed through it. "Get me my phone." Rafe handed it to him without comment. Dorian looked at the screen, the missed call from that morning, the single initial. He pressed call back. It rang twice before a voice answered, low, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd been awake for hours and had decided not to be annoyed about it. You're alive. I'm alive. Are you clean? Reasonably. I need Carver's number. A pause. That's a particular escalation. Someone used the Caloran network as a blind and had my route 2 hours after it was set. You do the math. Another pause, longer. Then, I'll send it? Dorian, don't. I'm going to anyway. Be careful with the woman. The line went dead. Dorian looked at the phone for a moment, then he put it face down on the bedsheet and looked at the door. He thought about a 9-year-old boy with his own gray eyes holding a stack of washcloths and explaining capillary pressure to a man twice his height. He thought about Elena's hands on the intake desk, the way she'd look down at the form before he could see her face, the particular discipline of that, the practiced nature of it, the way it had the quality of something done so many times it had become reflex. 10 years of that, 10 years of looking down. He thought, never again. Elena got Noah to school 11 minutes before the bell, which counted as a success by the metrics of that morning. He went in without a fuss, which she was grateful for, because she hadn't had the conversation with him yet, and she wasn't sure she had the language for it yet. He was perceptive enough to know that. He was perceptive enough to have not pushed since the car. At the school gate, he turned back once. Just looked at her with those gray eyes, steady and clear. "We'll talk later," he said. "Later," she agreed. He nodded and went in. She sat in the car for 2 minutes. Then she drove to the diner. The breakfast rush had already peaked by the time she got there, and the place was in its mid-morning lull. A few booths occupied, the smell of coffee and bacon grease, Terrence behind the counter doing his slow, methodical pre-noon prep that he did every day and that no one had ever managed to rush. He looked up when she came through the back. "You look like you drove through a wall," he said. "Long shift." "Longer than usual?" "Terrence." Right. He went back to his prep. "Booth 4 needs a refill, and the guy in booth 7 has been here since 8 and ordered 1 coffee, and I think he might be waiting for someone." She tied her apron, grabbed the coffee pot, and went out to the floor. The man in booth 7 was not waiting for someone. He was reading a newspaper, actual paper, which was already unusual, and he had a cup of coffee that was barely touched. He was in his mid-40s, she estimated, lean in the specific way that came from something other than exercise, and he was wearing a jacket that was slightly too warm for the weather. She refilled his cup. He didn't look up from the paper. She moved to booth 4, then booth 2, then back behind the counter. Did it again. The diner worked in its regular rhythms, and she moved inside them by muscle memory, the way she'd learned to move inside every job, conserving energy, staying present enough to do it well without burning anything she needed for later. At 11:45, the man in booth 7 folded his newspaper. He looked at her. "Ms. Mercer." She set the coffee pot down on the counter slowly. "You have the wrong person." "No," he said pleasantly. "I really don't. Could you sit down for a moment?" "I'm working." "I know. I'll be brief." He didn't look threatening. That was the thing. He had the specific inoffensiveness of someone who had cultivated it professionally. "I represent a party who has an interest in your well-being, and who wanted me to convey that last night's situation at Mercy General has created a complication they hadn't anticipated." She looked at him. "Who do you work for?" "That's the part I'm not authorized to share. What I can share is that the complication is being managed and that your current routine presents certain exposure points that should be addressed." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," he said. Simply, not unkindly. "You've known for 10 years. You've been careful for 10 years. Last night something changed, and the people I represent want you to know they're aware of that change." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on the table, plain white, a phone number, and nothing else. "If you need anything, if you feel unsafe, call that number." He left a 20 on the table and walked out. Elena stood behind the counter for a long moment. Then she went to booth 7, picked up the 20, and took the business card to the back. She turned it over, nothing on the reverse. She took out her phone and typed a text to a number she hadn't used in 4 years. Someone just made contact. Middle-aged male, newspaper, booth approach, clean method. "Who's running cleanup on the east side right now?" She stared at the text for a moment, then she deleted it without sending, because the person on the other end of that number was someone she'd trusted once, and the world had shifted enough overnight that trust was a thing she needed to be careful with. She tucked the card into her apron pocket and went back to work. At 2 in the afternoon, she got a text from a number she didn't recognize. Noah's school lets out at 3:15. I have 2 people 30 seconds from the gate. Not a threat, an offer. D. She read it 3 times. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She typed, "How did you get this number?" The response came in 4 seconds. "Same way I found you the first time, 11 years ago. You gave it to a hospital intake system at 9:58 last night. I had Rafe pull the employee records at 6:45 this morning. You should probably change it." She stared at the screen. In spite of everything, in spite of the diner apron and the exhaustion and the fear she'd been managing with both hands all day, something involuntary happened at the edge of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The memory of one. She typed, "Tell your people to stay visible. If Noah sees someone lurking, he'll try to talk to them." A pause. Then, "Noted. He gets that from his mother." She put the phone in her apron pocket. Went back to the floor. At 2:58, her phone buzzed again. Same number. "We need to talk tonight. I found something in the financial records. Something that changes what you know about why you left." She stopped in the middle of the diner floor, the coffee pot in her hand, a customer 3 feet away waiting for his refill. She poured the coffee. She said the right things. She moved through the next 17 minutes of her shift on autopilot, the text sitting in her chest like something with weight to it, something that changes what you know about why you left. She'd left because of a document, because a man had shown her a timeline and names and proof of a conspiracy and told her that the only way Dorian Viscari survived it was if she disappeared from his life completely. Because she was the leverage, she was the soft point, she was the thing they would use against him when the time came. She'd believed it. She'd believed it because the document was real. She'd verified what she could, cross-referenced the names, checked the dates against events she knew. It had been real. But she had never asked one question. She'd been too scared, too young, too in love, and too desperate to ask the one question that mattered most. Who gave you the document? At 3:45, after she'd picked Noah up from school and driven home and gotten him started on his homework, her phone rang. The unknown number. She answered it. "There were 3 names on the internal communication you were shown," Dorian said without preamble. "The conspiracy, the timeline. Yes, 2 of them are dead. 1 is still active. His name is—" She heard it, the name, and the floor did something strange under her feet, something that required her to sit down on the kitchen chair with more weight than she intended. Because the name Dorian said was not one of the 3 names on the document she'd been shown 10 years ago. It was the name of the man who had shown it to her. "He wasn't supposed to be on that document," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He gave it to me. He was the one who warned me." "I know," Dorian said. "He was also the one who ordered the hit. He used the conspiracy to remove you. 2 birds. 1 document." A pause. "Elena, the conspiracy in that document was real, but the person who showed it to you wasn't saving you. He was finishing the job." She sat with that for a moment. 10 years. 10 years of a decision she'd made based on information from a man who had manufactured the need for her to make it. She thought about Noah asking every birthday. She thought about the exhaustion, the 3 jobs, the envelope above the refrigerator. She thought about being 24 years old and alone and pregnant and terrified in a city she didn't know, believing she'd done the only thing that could be done. "Elena," his voice, quiet, the same weight she'd heard in it at 6 in the morning. "Are you there?" "I'm here," she said. "I need you to bring me whatever you kept from that time, whatever you have, because Cassius Fairmay has been building something for 10 years, and last night was not his first attempt, and I don't think he's finished." Cassius Fairmay, the name from Rafe's morning report, the name she now had a new reason to know. "He knows about Noah," she said. "Yes. He's known, probably from the beginning. He would have had people watching for you, waiting." His voice was controlled. The jaw thing, she thought. The jaw thing was happening on the other end of the line, she could tell from the way the words came out. He didn't move on you before because you were more useful as a potential lever, a contingency. If I ever got too close to him, if I ever started to unravel what he'd built, he'd use us. Yes. She looked at the kitchen table, the kettle, the ordinary surface of a life she'd built one careful layer at a time. I have copies, she said, of everything I verified 10 years ago. I kept them. A pause. Something in the silence that she couldn't fully name. Then, how long have you been carrying that? Since the beginning. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not softer, exactly. Something more precise than soft. I'm being discharged tomorrow morning, against medical advice because I don't have the patience for 2 weeks of limited mobility. I need you to bring what you have to... The kitchen window exploded inward. Not glass. The window was intact. It was the frame that blew, the blind snapping sideways, and Elena was on her feet and moving before she'd consciously processed the sound, moving toward the hallway, toward Noah's room, her shoulder catching the door frame and her phone clattering to the floor. Noah! He was in the doorway of his room, homework in hand, eyes wide, already moving toward her because whatever she looked like had told him what he needed to know. She grabbed his arm, moved him to the interior wall. Her phone was on the kitchen floor. She could hear Dorian's voice from it, sharp, clipped, saying her name. A second sound from outside, not a window this time. The door buzzer. 3 short bursts. The pattern that her neighbor Mrs. Farida used when something was wrong. Elena looked at Noah. He looked back at her. 9 years old, her dark hair, his father's gray eyes, and the expression on his face was not fear. It was the particular focused calm of a child who had inherited something from both parents and was discovering in this moment what it was made of. What do we do? He said. She looked at the door, at the kitchen where her phone was, at her son. She thought, there is no version of this where we stay in this apartment. She thought, the envelope above the refrigerator. She crossed to the kitchen in 4 steps, picked up her phone. I'm here, we have a problem. Grabbed the envelope from the cabinet, Noah's coat from the hook by the door, and looked through the peephole. Mrs. Farida was in the hallway, and behind her, visible at the far end of the corridor near the stairwell door, 2 men she had never seen before were moving fast. On the phone, Dorian said, Black SUV, side exit. Rafe is 60 seconds out. You already had people here. Yes. You didn't tell me. I knew you'd tell me not to. She grabbed Noah's hand. Side exit, she said to him. Fast. They went. And behind them, the 2 men in the corridor reached the apartment door and found it open and empty, the kitchen light still on, a child's homework spread across the table, a phone charger still plugged into the wall, all the ordinary evidence of a life that had just, in the space of 60 seconds, run out of time to stay ordinary. The side exit door hit the outer wall, and the cold came in fast, the kind of wet November cold that found the gaps in everything, and Elena had Noah's wrist and was moving before the door finished swinging. The alley behind the building ran between 2 brick walls to a cross street 40 feet out. A black SUV sat at the alley's mouth, engine running, and Rafe was already out of the passenger side, moving toward them with the compressed efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this kind of extraction enough times that it had no wasted motion in it. Vehicle, he said, gesturing without breaking stride. Elena pulled Noah closer. Who else is in the car? 2 of mine, both clean. You said that like it should mean something to me. It means they're not Fermes. He looked at her steadily. We have approximately 90 seconds before the men in your building reach the street-facing exits and call in a position. Get in the car. Noah looked up at Rafe, then at his mother. He's the man from the hospital, he said, the one who was watching you leave. Rafe looked down at the boy with an expression that was as close to startled as Elena suspected his face ever got. Get in, Elena said. They got in. The SUV moved before the door was fully closed, smooth and fast, turning away from the building's front face and threading through the back streets with the specific route logic of someone who had mapped this neighborhood in advance. Elena watched the mirrors. Noah sat beside her and did not speak, which she was grateful for because she needed the silence to think, and she could feel him exercising the particular restraint that he exercised when he understood the situation was serious. Her phone was in her hand. Dorian's number still on the screen. She typed, "We're in the car. Where are we going?" The response came immediately. The Aldrin property, 40 minutes north. Rafe has the address. Who else knows about the Aldrin property? A pause, longer than his previous responses. Then, 3 people, all pre-Ferme, all. She put the phone in her coat pocket and looked out the window at the city moving past. The ordinary afternoon of it, people on sidewalks and kids outside a convenience store and a woman walking a dog in a yellow raincoat. And she thought about the envelope in her lap, the copies of documents she'd verified 10 years ago, the names she'd memorized and the dates she'd matched against public records, and the wire transfers she'd traced as far as she could trace them, with the resources available to a 24-year-old woman who'd been running on terror and love and the specific clarity that came from knowing that the wrong move would get someone killed. She looked at the envelope. She thought about what Dorian had said on the phone before the window frame blew. The person who showed it to you wasn't saving you. He was finishing the job. She'd spent the 40-minute drive not opening the envelope. She'd spent it watching the city give way to highway and the highway give way to a suburban stretch that thinned gradually into something greener and less crowded. And she'd watched Noah look out his window with the systematic attention he paid to new environments, cataloging them, filing them. At some point, he'd put his hand over hers on the seat between them. Just set it there, warm and certain, not squeezing, just present. She'd turned her hand over and held his. The Aldrin property was a house set back from a private road behind a tree line, built in the kind of older style that suggested money that didn't need to announce itself. Not a compound, no visible fortification, no gates that looked like gates, but the placement was deliberate, the approaches limited. And when the SUV pulled around to the side entrance, Elena counted 3 additional vehicles already there, parked in the loose discipline of people who'd arrived quickly but not panicked. Dorian was standing on the side steps. He was dressed in dark clothes, his right arm slightly held away from his body at the angle of someone compensating for a wound, and he had the look of a man who had discharged himself from a hospital bed through sheer argumentative force. He looked at the car. He looked at the window where Noah was visible, his face against the glass, looking back. Something happened on Dorian's face that Elena couldn't name and didn't try to. She got out first. Noah followed. Dorian came down the steps at the careful pace his side required. He stopped 3 feet from them and looked at Noah with the same expression he'd had in the trauma room. Not soft exactly, but its opposite of soft wasn't hard. It was something else, unguarded. Like a man who'd had every defense in place for 10 years and had just discovered that one particular thing simply walked through all of them. Noah looked at him. "Your wound is pulling," he said, "the way you're holding your arm." "I know." "You should be in the hospital." "Probably." "Why aren't you?" "Because someone tried to use my being in the hospital against someone I care about." Noah processed this. His eyes moved to his mother and back. "Okay," he said, with the calm of a child who had filed this information and reached a conclusion. Then, "You're my father." It wasn't a question. It had the weight of something he'd been carrying for a while and had finally decided to set down in the right place. Dorian looked at him for a long moment. "Yes." "Okay," Noah said again, and then, because he was 9 years old and had been processing this since a hospital waiting room at 6 in the morning, he said, "Can I go inside? I didn't finish my homework." Elena made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Rafe, behind her, made no sound at all, but she felt him exercise the effort. "Inside," Elena said. "Stay with—" She looked at Rafe. "Rafe," Noah supplied, because he'd already filed that name too. "Stay with Rafe, don't touch anything." "I won't touch anything important," Noah said, which was a distinction she recognized and didn't have the energy to argue. He went up the steps and inside, and she heard him ask Rafe something about the house's construction date before the door closed. She stood in the cold with Dorian. "He's extraordinary," Dorian said. "He's 9. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She looked at him, the wound, the careful posture, the face that was 10 years harder than the one she'd known. "You shouldn't be standing out here." "I know. Walk with me anyway. I need to show you something." They went inside through a side hallway into what was clearly being used as a working room, a table covered in printed documents, a laptop, 2 phones, a whiteboard on wheels with a diagram she couldn't fully parse from the doorway. A man she didn't know was working at the laptop. He looked up when they came in, registered Elena, and looked at Dorian. "Give us the room," Dorian said. The man left. Dorian moved to the table, picked up a folder and held it out to her. "Carver pulled this in 6 hours, which is what I pay Carver for." She took the folder. The first page was a wire transfer record, large numbers, multiple currencies, moving through a series of holding companies that she recognized the structure of. She'd seen this kind of thing in the documents she'd copied 10 years ago, the same layering, the same intermediate stops. She turned the page. The second page was a communication transcript. Internal. Time-stamped 11 years ago. She read it. She read it twice. "This is from before I left," she said. "Yes." "This is—" She stopped, read a specific passage again. "This is Ferme authorizing a payment to—" She looked up. "To Marcus Vale." "Yes." Marcus Vale, the man who had shown her the envelope 10 years ago in a parking structure and told her that Dorian Viscari was going to be killed by his own people, and that she was the leverage they'd use to manage him, and that the only way any of them survived was if she disappeared. The man whose warning she had believed completely because he had given her 37 pages of verified documentation and the name of the bank account and the timeline down to the week. Marcus Vale, whose name was not on the document she'd been shown, whose name she had never considered because he'd been the one standing across from her holding the proof. "He was Ferme's," she said. "He was Ferme's from before I took over from my father, a plant. 11 years of patience." Dorian's voice had the flatness of controlled fury, the sound of something very large being kept at a specific temperature. "He identified you as a vulnerability. Ferme decided you were too close to me, that if the eventual move against me was going to work, you needed to be removed from the board first. Not killed. That would have triggered something uncontrollable. Just gone. Completely gone. In a way that I'd read as betrayal and close every door on." She was very still. "The conspiracy he showed you was real," Dorian said. "Those 3 men were actually planning to move against me. Vale didn't fabricate it. He found it and used it, told you the truth about the threat and lied about the solution, made you believe that running was the only option, that coming to me would get us both killed." He paused. "The 3 men in the conspiracy were dealt with internally, 18 months after you left. Ferme had them removed. Not to protect me. To eliminate the competition. He was always planning to make his own move. He just needed the board cleared first." She set the folder down on the table. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Her hands. The hands that had emptied 37 trash cans yesterday and written fraction explanations for a 9-year-old the night before and gripped a steering wheel in an alley 40 minutes ago. "He used the truth to tell me a lie," she said. "Yes, and I ran. You were 24 years old, and you'd been handed 37 pages of documentation by someone you had no reason to distrust." His voice shifted. Not softer, but less compressed, like something releasing a fraction of the pressure. "Elena, you made the only decision you thought you could make. I left you." The words came out plain, stripped of everything. "I left you, and I raised your son alone for 9 years. And the entire basis for that decision was manipulation. Flat, final. By a man who is still operational and who tried to have me killed last night and who sent 2 people to your apartment this afternoon." He looked at her. "The guilt is yours to work through however you need to. Later. Right now I need what's in that envelope." She looked at it. The envelope she'd carried for 10 years. The copies, the photographs, the handwritten notes in her own 24-year-old handwriting, the names and dates and amounts she'd spent 3 weeks compiling before she ran. She picked it up and put it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. "Thank you," he said. Quiet. The 2 words doing more work than 2 words usually had to. She nodded and looked away. He opened the envelope. They spent 2 hours at that table. Elena and Dorian and a man named Carver, who came back in at Dorian's request, 50s, rumpled, the specific dishevelment of someone whose mind was always running faster than his attention to appearance, And together they laid out what Elena had kept against what Carver had pulled in 6 hours and what Dorian's own records contained. The picture that emerged was not what Elena had expected. It was larger. It had more layers. It had been running not for 10 years, but for 15, from before Dorian's father died, from before Dorian took over. A long, patient architecture of financial misdirection, shell companies, leverage accumulated on politicians and judges and law enforcement figures, a criminal organization's infrastructure slowly being hollowed out and rebuilt around a different center of gravity without the man at the top ever seeing it happen because the man doing it had been trusted at the table for 15 years. He controls the Eastern port contracts, Carver said, tapping a column of figures. All of them, through 4 intermediaries. The money that goes through those contracts, he ran a number, is enough to fund an independent operation. He doesn't need Vescari resources anymore. He's been running parallel for at least 3 years. Then why the hit last night? Rafe said from the doorway. He'd come back in after settling Noah, who had apparently finished his homework and moved on to interrogating the house's bookshelves. Because I was getting close, Dorian said. He tapped one of Elena's documents, a wire transfer record she'd copied from a financial file she'd photographed in a parking structure 10 years ago. This account, I had an audit running on it 6 weeks ago, routine. But if Fairmay has anyone in my financial team, he does, Carver said. I found her this afternoon, junior analyst, brought on 2 years ago. She's been flagging audit activity to an outside number. The room went still. Dorian looked at Carver. Name? Daria Penn. Dorian looked at Rafe. Rafe was already on his phone. Elena watched this exchange, the economy of it, the practiced efficiency of men who had been running this machinery together for years, and thought about how little any of this looked like what people thought it looked like from the outside. It looked like a business with a very specific kind of HR problem. It looked like project management for catastrophe. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it. Not Dorian's number. Different. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Miss Mercer. A voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, the particular unhurried cadence of someone who believed they had more time than the person they were calling. I hope you're somewhere comfortable. I understand the afternoon's been eventful. She looked up. Dorian was already watching her. He'd seen her face change. Who is this? She said. Someone who would like very much to resolve this situation without further escalation. I think you and I have a mutual interest in that. I don't know who you are. You know my associate Marcus Vale. She went cold. Not the cold of the alley. Something deeper. Yes? Then you understand the scope of what we're discussing. Miss Mercer, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're someone who responds better to directness than to theater. A pause. Your son is very bright. The homework he left on the kitchen table had already corrected 2 errors in the fraction problems, in red pen, with the corrected working shown. That's impressive for a 9-year-old. She stopped breathing. Dorian was across the table in 3 steps, his hand out for the phone. She held up one finger. Wait. What do you want? She said. A conversation. In person. Just you, in 2 hours. He gave an address. If you bring Vescari or any of his people, the conversation becomes something else. If you don't come, the conversation becomes something else. Another pause. I'm not threatening the boy, Miss Mercer. I want to be clear about that. I'm simply demonstrating that we've been paying attention. We've been paying attention for a very long time. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. Dorian's hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, just present. Talk. She told him. All of it, word for word, the way she'd trained herself to repeat things accurately from the intake desk, where getting a name or a number wrong had consequences. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Dorian's jaw was doing the thing. His hand was still on her wrist. You're not going, he said. He said, I heard what he said. You're not going alone to an address provided by the man who has been trying to destroy my organization for 15 years and who sent 2 armed men to your apartment 3 hours ago. He said he's not threatening Noah. He also said Marcus Vale is his associate. Marcus Vale spent 11 years lying to both of us. I don't put weight on what this man says. She looked at him. If I don't go, if you go alone, you're a hostage by the time you clear the door. His voice was controlled and absolute. That's not a risk I'm taking. It's not your risk to take. Elena. His hand tightened slightly on her wrist. Not to restrain, to hold. I have missed 9 years. 9 years of him, of you, of whatever this was supposed to be. I am not... He stopped. Started again. I am not watching you walk into Cassius Ferme's hands because he made a phone call designed to make you feel like you have to. She held his gaze. Then what do we do? He looked at Carver. The address. Carver had already pulled it up. He read it out. Dorian looked at Rafe. Something passed between them. The shorthand of 11 years. It's the waterfront, Rafe said. The old Marchetti facility. Ferme owns it through a subsidiary. He's been using it for storage. He paused. It's also the cleanest site in the city for a controlled conversation that doesn't leave a record. Or a controlled disappearance, Carver said without inflection. Elena felt the shape of it. The address wasn't a meeting place. It was a location Ferme controlled entirely, chosen to communicate that control, to demonstrate that he could name her son's homework corrections and give her 2 hours and still hold all the geometry. She thought about the envelope on the table, the 15 years of architecture Carver had laid out, the junior analyst named Daria Penn who had been flagging audits for 2 years. She thought about something else. She picked up the folder Dorian had shown her when they'd first sat down, turned to the 3rd page, which she hadn't fully read during the initial review. A different kind of record. Not wire transfers, not communications. Property holdings. She found what she was looking for. The Eastern Port contracts, she said to Carver. The intermediaries. What's the last company in the chain before it hits Ferme's private account? Carver checked his notes. A company called Ardent Maritime Holdings. And who is the registered officer of Ardent Maritime Holdings? Carver checked again. Longer this time. Then his expression changed. Not much, but enough. Marcus Vale. She set the folder down. Vale isn't just Ferme's associate, she said. He's a co-owner of the revenue structure. He's been drawing from those contracts, which means... She looked at Dorian. Which means that if Ferme goes down, Vale goes down too. They're financially joined. Dorian was looking at her with an expression she remembered. The specific attention he paid when someone said something that shifted the geometry of a problem. Which means Vale has as much stake in tonight as Ferme does, Rafe said from the doorway. Which means tonight isn't a conversation, Elena said. It's a consolidation. The room processed that. Into the silence, from somewhere deeper in the house, came the sound of Noah's voice, clear and completely unbothered, asking Rafe's man whether the bookshelf in the hall was organized by publication date or alphabetically, because it appeared to be neither, and that seemed like a missed opportunity. Elena felt the specific pain of loving someone so completely that it was indistinguishable from fear. She looked at Dorian. I'm not going alone, she said. But I'm going. Elena. I have something Ferme doesn't know I have. I spent 10 years building it. Every copy I made, every photograph, every account number I wrote down by hand. She tapped the envelope. This isn't everything. This is what I kept here. The rest is stored. Offline, partitioned, in 3 locations with 3 different people who have instructions to release it to specific journalists and federal contacts if I fail to check in on a schedule. She watched his face. I built a dead man switch, Dorian. A year after I ran, when I realized running wasn't going to be permanent, I built it, and I've been maintaining it for 9 years. The silence was different now. You've had the capability to destroy Ferme's operation for 9 years, Dorian said slowly. I've had the capability to create a significant federal problem for a financial structure that I didn't fully understand. Now, she looked at Carver's notes at the shape they'd assembled in 2 hours. Now I understand it. Now it's not just a problem. It's a complete exposure. Dorian looked at her for a long time. You built a weapon and kept it quiet for 9 years. I built insurance, she said, in case running stopped being enough. And you didn't use it. I didn't want to use it. Using it meant this. She gestured at the room, at him, at all of it. It meant surfacing. It meant Noah being visible. She paused. But Ferme moved first. The choice is already made. Dorian was quiet for a moment, then he looked at Rafe. New plan, he said. Rafe straightened. She goes to the meeting, Dorian said. Not alone. Not with visible coverage. If Ferme sees my people, he'll burn the site and we lose the opportunity. She goes in wired, with Carver monitoring the feed, and with enough on her to demonstrate to Ferme that the dead man's switch is real and active. He looked at Elena. You go in, you show him what you have, and you tell him that the release schedule has already been activated, that the only way to stop it is an agreement, a public one, that can't be quietly removed. And if he doesn't agree? He will, Dorian said, because the only alternative is that everything he's built for 15 years hits a federal database in the morning and he spends the rest of his life in a cell. A pause. And because I'll be in the building. You said no visible, not visible, present. He looked at her steadily. I'm not sending you into that building without me in it. That's not negotiable. She held his gaze, thought about arguing, thought about 9 years of doing everything alone and where it had gotten her. Okay, she said. He nodded, looked at Carver. How fast can you get a working wire on her? 20 minutes. Do it. He looked at Rafe. The building layout. I'll have it in 10. The room moved. People moved through it, efficient and directed. And Elena stood at the table and looked at the assembled evidence of 15 years of someone else's long patience and thought about what it meant that she had quietly, without fanfare, been building her own. Then she thought about Noah in the hall asking about alphabetical organization, and she walked to the door and looked out at him. Sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book in his lap, Rafe's man sitting in a chair 3 feet away with the resigned look of a person who had just been talked into a conversation about deep-sea bioluminescence. Noah looked up. Hey, he said. Hey. She leaned in the doorway. You okay? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I think so. A pause. Mom, is this going to be over soon? She thought about the waterfront building, the 2 hours on the clock, the wire Carver was going to put on her in 20 minutes. Yes, she said. I think so. And then we can go home? She looked at him, at his face, the mix of both of them in it, the steadiness that was his own. We'll figure out what home looks like going forward, she said. But yes, then we can go home. He nodded, looked back at his book, then without looking up, he seems like someone who's been alone for a long time. She was quiet. Like you, Noah said, but different. She stayed in the doorway for another moment. Then she went back to the room where the men were moving fast and the clock was running, and the weight of 15 years of someone else's architecture was about to be answered with 9 years of her own. At 7:44 in the evening, Rafe got a text from a number that had been dormant for 2 years. A number belonging to a man inside the Ferme organization who had been turned 18 months ago and kept quiet against exactly this kind of moment. The text said, Ferme knows about the dead man's switch. He's known for 6 months. He has a countermeasure. Don't send her in. Rafe read it, looked up. Across the room, Elena was already wearing the wire, Carver running a test signal, Dorian beside her checking the adhesion of the transmitter with the careful hands of a man who was about to let someone he had just found walk back toward danger. Rafe looked at the text, looked at the room. If he showed Dorian the text, the plan stopped. Dorian would not let her go into a building where Ferme held a countermeasure to the only leverage they had. The meeting would be abandoned, and Ferme would know they'd lost their nerve and the window would close, and Ferme would use the next 6 hours to disappear everything and everyone into arrangements that would take years to untangle. If he didn't show him the text, Elena walked into a building where the one thing protecting her had already been neutralized. Rafe stood in the doorway of the working room with the phone in his hand and made the decision that he would spend a long time afterward either justifying or carrying, depending on how the next 2 hours went. He put the phone in his pocket. Wire's good, Carver said. Signal's clean. Elena looked up, met Rafe's eyes across the room. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Something moved through his face. Just a flicker, just the smallest possible shift. And she filed it without knowing yet what she'd filed, the way you registered a wrong note in a familiar piece of music before you'd consciously identified which note was wrong. Let's go, Dorian said. They went.
The waterfront smelled like rust and brine and the particular cold that came off open water in November, the kind that got into your clothes and stayed there. Elena walked the last 100 meters alone.
That had been the agreement. Dorian's vehicle stopped at the perimeter of the lot, invisible from the facility's main entrance, and she covered the rest on foot. She could feel the wire against her ribs, the transmitter Carver had taped above her left hip, thin as a bandage, and she walked with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided not to show the fear. Not because the fear wasn't real, but because showing it cost something she needed to keep. Behind her in the dark, Dorian watched her go. He'd said nothing when she'd opened the car door. He'd looked at her for a second, the particular look of a man who had too many things to say and had calculated that none of them fit inside the available time. And then he'd put his hand against the side of her face, briefly, the way you touch something you were afraid of losing before you let it out of reach. She'd covered his hand with hers for 1 second. Then she'd gotten out of the car. The Marchetti facility was a warehouse complex that had processed shipping containers in a previous life, and it wore its decommission badly. The main structure was intact, but everything decorative had been stripped away, the exterior lighting reduced to 2 working floods above the entrance that turned the concrete pale orange and made the shadows behind them absolute. The dockside was open to the water, chain-link fencing with enough gaps in it to suggest it was more symbolic than functional. A man at the door. One visible one. Large, jacket too heavy for the temperature, which meant he was armed underneath it. He looked at her and stepped aside without speaking, which meant she'd been described and expected, which meant Ferme had been watching the car for longer than the final 100 meters. She filed that and went inside. The interior was large and mostly empty. Whatever Rafe's intelligence had said about storage, the usable floor had been cleared or had never been used as described. Overhead fluorescents, half of them out, the working ones giving the space a clinical flicker. The smell of concrete and standing water from somewhere below the floor. Cassius Ferme was at the far end, standing at a folding table with papers on it, dressed like a man who'd come from an office meeting. Jacket, tie, the whole performance. He was 61, and looked it in the way that men who'd spent decades under controlled stress looked it, the face showing the years without surrendering to them. Silver hair, neat. The posture of someone who had never found it necessary to physically intimidate anyone himself, because he'd always had other people for that. 2 men flanked him. Left and right, evenly spaced, the placement too precise to be casual. Beside Ferme, standing slightly behind his right shoulder, was Marcus Vale. Elena stopped walking when she saw him. Vale was 63. She hadn't seen him in 10 years. He'd aged less than she'd expected. The same compact build, the same watchful stillness. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not guilt, not defiance, something more complicated than either. "Miss Mercer," Ferme said, "thank you for coming." She looked at Vale for another second, then at Ferme. "You said just you." "I said come alone. I didn't specify who would be here." He gestured toward a chair that had been placed in the center of the cleared floor. Not at the table, Matt. In the middle of the room. A deliberate choice, the choreography of someone who wanted her framed a specific way. "Please." She didn't sit.
"Let's do this standing." He studied her. "As you like." He picked up a paper from the table. "I'm going to be direct, as I said on the phone. You've spent the evening with Dorian Viscari and his people compiling what I assume is a substantial case from the documents you've been carrying for 10 years combined with whatever his analysts pulled today." He set the paper down. "And you believe that case, combined with the release mechanism you've built, gives you leverage over this situation, doesn't it?" "It did," he said. 6 months ago, when I became aware of the release mechanism's structure, I began building a counter-architecture. The journalists you've seated, the federal contacts, the 3 people holding partitioned copies." He picked up a different paper. "I've spent 6 months quietly placing material with each of those parties that contextualizes your information in a way that makes it look like fabrication. Manufacturing context is considerably easier than manufacturing evidence. You only need to create enough doubt." He looked at her. "If your mechanism triggers tonight, the release will be met by a pre-existing counter-narrative that your federal contacts have already partially accepted. I've seen to it." The room was very quiet. She felt the shape of it, the 6 months of work against 9 years of hers,
The specific patience of a man who had spent 15 years building something and was not going to let one woman's insurance policy dismantle it. She thought about what Rafe's face had done in the doorway. She thought, he knew. "So you're telling me I have nothing," she said. "I'm telling you that what you have is considerably less than you think, which is why I wanted this conversation. Because what I'm offering," he clasped his hands in front of him, the gesture of a man presenting a business proposal, "is simple. You take your son and you go. Somewhere new. Comfortable. I'll arrange resources, the kind that make the three-job life unnecessary. You go and you stay gone, and the mechanism you've built is dismantled properly, so it can't be triggered by accident, and this is finished. And Dorian, Viscari will be managed separately. That's not your concern." The word managed in the specific tone he used, it landed exactly the way he intended it to. She let it land. Let him watch her face register what he meant and react to it, because she needed him to believe she was assessing his offer seriously. She said, "You've had this countermeasure for 6 months, and you still tried to have him killed last night. The countermeasure addresses your leverage. His continued operation addresses a different problem." He looked at her without apology. "These are separate matters. And my son, you said you weren't threatening him." "I'm not. I'm describing a transaction in which he benefits significantly." He paused. "He's 9 years old and extremely intelligent. What I'm offering him is a future without this." Another gesture, sir. The room, the facility, all of it. A clean start, funded appropriately. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Marcus Vale. "You told me," she said to Vale directly for the first time. "You stood in a parking structure and you told me that the only way to save his life was to make him believe I'd chosen to leave. You gave me 37 pages of documentation. I verified 22 of them independently." Vale looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not guilt, she'd decided by now, but something adjacent. The expression of a man who had made a calculation a long time ago and had been living inside the results of it ever since. The documentation was accurate. The documentation was accurate, and the conclusion you drew from it was a lie. The conclusion I drew from it was the operationally correct one given the objective. His voice was even, uninflected. You were a vulnerability. Removing you removed the vulnerability. The method I used caused less damage than the alternatives. Less damage, she said. Yes. You cost me 10 years. You cost him 9 years of his son's life. You cost Noah his father for the first 9 years of his life. Her voice didn't rise. She kept it level with both hands, the way she'd kept everything level for 10 years. And she looked at Marcus Vale and said quietly, "That's what you call less damage." Vale said nothing. Ferme said, "Miss Mercer, the offer." In her earpiece, so small it was invisible, Carver's work, she heard a single click, the signal they'd agreed on. 1 click meant the wire was transmitting clearly. 2 clicks would mean abort. 3 clicks would mean Dorian was in the building. She'd heard 1 click when she'd come through the door. She heard 3 now. She kept her face completely neutral. "I need a minute," she said to Ferme. "Of course." She turned away from him, facing the dockside wall, the open chain link gaps, the black water beyond them, and pressed 2 fingers to her jaw, the gesture of someone thinking, which also happened to be the gesture she and Carver had agreed on to indicate she needed 30 seconds of live communication. Carver's voice in her ear barely above silence. "Counter-narrative is real. We've confirmed 2 of the 3 federal contacts have received material. But Dorian found something in your envelope. Page 11, bottom account number. It's not in the counter-narrative because Ferme didn't know it existed. Dorian says use it." She thought about page 11. She'd photographed a financial document 10 years ago. A handwritten ledger page, not a printed record, the kind of thing that existed in exactly 1 copy because it had been written by hand precisely to avoid digital trails. She'd photographed it without fully understanding what she was looking at because she'd been photographing everything she could reach. She'd included it in the envelope because it was there. She hadn't given it particular weight. She thought about what a handwritten ledger page meant compared to a printed record. It meant no digital original. It meant no counter-narrative could address it because Ferme hadn't known it was in her possession. It meant the one piece of evidence that had survived outside his awareness for 10 years was on page 11 of what she'd put on that table 4 hours ago. She turned back around. Page 11 of what I handed your people tonight, she said to Ferme. The handwritten ledger. Account ending in 7741. Something happened on Ferme's face. Small, almost nothing. But she'd spent 10 years reading faces across an intake desk at 3 in the morning, reading people at their worst, reading the difference between pain and fear, and the specific expression of someone who had just been told something they hadn't expected to hear. She saw it. That account predates your formal operation by 4 years, she said, which means it predates your legitimate business front by 4 years, which means whatever moved through it in those 4 years moved through it when you had no legal explanation for where it came from. She kept her voice even. That ledger is handwritten. It is not in any digital system. It was not included in any of the documentation you've been building a counter-narrative against because you didn't know it existed. She looked at him. It does exist. We have it. And it is not part of the release mechanism you've been working against for 6 months. It is a separate thing entirely. The room held. Ferme looked at Marcus Vale. Vale's face had gone careful in a way it hadn't been before. The account 7741, Vale said slowly, was closed. The account was closed. The ledger wasn't destroyed. Someone put it in a filing cabinet in an office building, and someone else photographed it 10 years ago and put the photograph in an envelope and kept the envelope above her refrigerator for 9 years. Elena held Ferme's gaze. Your counter-narrative addresses everything you knew about. It doesn't address what you didn't know about, and what you didn't know about is enough. Ferme was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted them. Then he said, Take her. The 2 men flanking him moved simultaneously. She'd known this was a possibility. She and Dorian had discussed it. If the conversation went wrong, if Ferme decided the ledger made the transaction impossible, she'd known it was possible. Knowing it and having it happen were different things. The man from the left was faster. He was on her in 3 strides, and his hand closed on her left arm above the elbow with the practiced grip of someone who'd done this before. Not violent exactly, just final. And she didn't pull away because pulling would make it worse, and she needed her next 4 seconds free. She said loudly and clearly for the wire, Account 7741, Cassius Ferme, Marcus Vale, Marchetti Facility. The facility's dockside door came off its frame. Not an explosion. A physical impact, someone hitting it from the outside with enough force and enough mass that the corroded hinge assembly simply gave way. The door went down and the cold came in, and Dorian Vescari came through the opening with 2 men behind him, and the expression on his face was not rage. It was something colder and more precise than rage. The look of a man who had calculated every acceptable outcome and had arrived at a number. The man holding Elena's arm let go, not from fear, from the operational instinct of someone reassessing a situation. He stepped back. Her arm was numb from the grip. Ferme hadn't moved. He was still at the table, hands still clasped, watching Dorian come across the floor with the composure of a man who had decided that showing alarm would cost him more than the alternative. Cassius, Dorian said. Dorian. Even, almost welcoming. You look terrible. You were in surgery this morning. Yesterday morning. I've been busy. So I see. Ferme's eyes moved to Elena, then back. This changes the parameters of the conversation, but not its essential structure. You came with 3 people. I have, he glanced toward the door she'd come through, considerably more than that in this building. I know, Dorian said. I've been in this building for 20 minutes. Your considerably more than 3 is currently having a difficult evening. A pause. Ferme looked at the door she'd entered through. The man who'd been stationed there was no longer visible. Dorian said, You built something for 15 years and it was genuinely impressive. The layering, the patience, the way you used the legitimate operations as cover while you rebuilt the structure around yourself. He stopped 6 feet from Ferme's table. I missed it for 15 years. I won't pretend otherwise. You were good. I'm still good, Ferme said. You're finished, Dorian said. The federal contacts your counter-narrative reached have been contacted in the last hour with corroborating material that addresses the doubt you'd seeded. Carver is thorough, more thorough than whoever you used. He glanced at Vale. The ledger gives us the foundation that makes everything else load-bearing. It's already been transmitted to 3 separate federal intake systems.
It's out of our hands now. There's nothing you can do tonight that changes what happens tomorrow morning. Ferme was quiet. Something crossed his face, not the small flicker from before. Something larger. The expression of a man who had run the numbers and arrived at a result he didn't like. He looked at Marcus Vale, and Marcus Vale took a gun from inside his jacket and pointed it at Dorian. Elena moved without thinking. 2 steps, and her body between Vale's line and Dorian's hand on her shoulder pulling her sideways simultaneously, both of them moving in the same direction so they collided instead of creating cover, both of them stumbling. And the shot that Vale fired went into the concrete floor 2 feet to Elena's left, and the sound of it inside the metal facility was enormous. Her ears rang. The world went briefly white at the edges. She was on the floor. Dorian was beside her, his hand on her arm, and she could see his face. The wound in his side had pulled, she could tell from the set of his jaw, and he was bleeding through the shirt, the dark spreading. The 2 men who'd come in with him were across the room engaging Ferme's people, the sounds of it sharp and physical, furniture and bodies. Vale was still standing. He was looking at the gun in his hand with an expression she had never expected to see on his face. The expression of a man who had just done something that had not been in the original calculation. He looked at Ferme. Ferme was moving toward the dockside opening, walking, not running. The composure still intact, the jacket still neat, moving with the particular unhurried purpose of a man who had an exit and intended to use it. Vale looked at Elena. She was on the floor with her hand pressed to Dorian's side, feeling the wet warmth of reopened wound through her fingers. Watching Marcus Vale stand in the middle of a building that was collapsing around him and look at her with an expression that had finally, after 30 seconds, resolved itself into something she recognized. Guilt. Actual guilt. The real version, not the adjacent thing. "The car outside," Vale said. "On the dockside. That's his exit." She stared at him. "The car outside," he said again, louder. "If he gets to it," Dorian said from the floor beside her, his voice strained but functional. "Rafe." He said it to the air, to the wire, to Carver on the other end of it. In her ear, 1 second later, Carver said, "Dockside car. Got it." Outside, 40 feet away, she heard Rafe's voice. Not words, just the specific tone of an instruction given clearly and quickly. Then she heard a car engine turn over and immediately stop, followed by the sound of doors. Ferme's voice from outside. "Get your hands!" And then nothing more. The building went quiet by degrees, the way fights went quiet when they were finished. Not all at once, but in sections, the sound stopping from one side and then another until only the water and the wind were left. Dorian was breathing through his nose, controlled. She could feel the effort of it under her hand. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "No." She pressed harder on the wound. "Dorian, I'm fine." "You're not fine, you—" "Elena." He covered her hand with his, pressed it down, looked at her with the gray eyes that their son had inherited exactly, steady and deep and holding something in them that 10 years hadn't touched. "I'm fine. We're fine." A breath. "It's done." She looked at him, at his face, at the blood on her hand and his. She thought, it's not done. There was still Ferme in custody and federal systems receiving transmitted material and the morning that would arrive with its own particular weight of consequence. There was still Noah at the Aldrin property asking Rafe's man about bookshelves. There was still a conversation she and Dorian had not yet had, the full version, the one that 9 years and 1 evening of emergency had not yet provided the space for. But she looked at him and she thought, this part, this particular shape of terror. Maybe this part is done. Marcus Vale was still standing in the middle of the floor. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was still holding the gun, pointed at nothing now, just held, the way a man holds something when he's trying to decide what to do with it. "Why did you tell me about the dock car?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been doing this for 11 years, he said. "And some things you can justify and some things you can't." He set the gun on the ground, stood up straight. "I can't justify the boy."
She stared at him. 9 years, he said. That wasn't in the operational calculation. That was... He stopped. That was a consequence I didn't account for. It was a child, she said. Flat. No heat. Just the plain fact of it. Yes. He looked at the gun on the floor. I'll cooperate with the federal intake, whatever they need. She said nothing. Dorian, from the floor. Rafe. Rafe appeared in the dock doorway. Took in the room in 3 seconds. Looked at Vale, looked at Elena, looked at Dorian on the floor with Elena's hand pressed to his side and his color not right. Medical, Elena said. Already called, Rafe said. 2 minutes. He walked to Vale, took his arm without drama, moved him toward the far wall. Then he came back and crouched beside Dorian with the assessment of a man who had seen this before and knew the difference between bad and bad enough. Hospital, Rafe said. Obviously, Dorian said. This time you're staying. We'll discuss it. No. Rafe looked at him with the patient certainty of 11 years. This time you're staying. Dorian looked at Elena. Something moved between them. Not language exactly. The older kind of communication, the kind that didn't require it. He's right, she said. You're taking his side. I'm taking the side of the person who isn't currently bleeding on a warehouse floor. She pressed her hand more firmly against his wound. Don't move. Didn't move. He lay on the concrete floor of the Marchetti facility with the cold coming in off the water and the sounds of the situation resolving around them. Rafe's voice, other voices, the dockside, the distant ordinary sounds of the city, indifferent above all of it. And he looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. Page 11, he said. Page 11. You didn't know what you had. I knew I had something. I just didn't know which something. She held his gaze. 9 years of not knowing which something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me something. In the hospital. Noah. She waited. He asked me why I stopped looking. His jaw tightened. He heard you in the trauma room. He overheard. I didn't realize he was... I know. She'd known from the hallway. What did you tell him? Nothing. I didn't have an answer yet. He looked at her. I have one now. She looked at him, at the blood, at the face that had been 10 years harder and still, underneath it, the same. Tell him later, she said, when you're not on a warehouse floor. Elena. Later, she said, firm, almost gentle. You're not allowed to have any important conversations until you stop bleeding. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. The first she'd heard from him. It cost him something physically, and he pressed his lips together. Okay, he said. Outside, the medical team's vehicle pulled up to the dock entrance, the lights of it sweeping through the chain-link gaps in blue and white, and Rafe went to meet them, and the night moved into its next phase the way nights did. Not ending exactly, just changing shape, the worst of it behind them and the rest of it still to be navigated but navigable. Finally, in a way it hadn't been for a very long time. Elena kept her hand pressed to Dorian's side and listened to him breathe, steady and careful, and thought about Noah asking, can we go home, and thought about what home was going to mean now, going forward, with the geometry of everything changed. She didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time in 10 years, the question felt like something she was allowed to ask out loud. And then Carver's voice came through her earpiece, quiet and precise, with the tone he used for information that changed things. Elena, the federal intake on the 7741 material. They just called back. A pause. There's a fourth name on the ledger. Someone we didn't identify tonight. Someone who's been operating parallel to Ferme for the same 15 years. Another pause. It's someone Dorian trusts. She looked at Dorian's face. She did not say it yet. He was bleeding. He needed the medical team that was crossing the dock floor right now, with their bags and their equipment and their focused professional calm. But she looked at his face and she thought, it is not done after all. She didn't tell him that night. She made that decision in the 30 seconds between Carver's voice in her ear and the medical team reaching them across the dock floor, and she held it through the controlled chaos of the next hour. Paramedics working on Dorian's side while he argued with them in the specific tone of a man who had decided arguing was less painful than lying still. Rafe coordinating the handoff of Fermi and Vale to federal contacts who arrived in 2 unmarked vehicles with the particular quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this material for a long time. She held it through the ambulance ride, sitting in the jump seat while they worked, watching his face for the color to come back. She held it through the second surgery, shorter than the first. The wound reclosed and the damage assessed as manageable. The word manageable, delivered by a surgeon who used it the way people used words when they meant something worse, but were choosing the more livable version. She held it until morning. Dorian came out of the anesthetic at 6:43. She knew the exact time because she was at the intake desk. Not working, just sitting in a chair they'd brought to the side of it, her coat still on, the wire Carver had put on her still taped above her hip because she hadn't had a moment to take it off. And she was looking at the clock above the door when the nurse came out and said he was asking for her. She went in. He looked worse than the first time. The first time 12 hours ago, he'd been fresh from the field. The wound new. Now he had 2 surgeries behind him and the specific depletion of a body that had been through too much in too short a span. His color was bad. The IV was back in his left arm. He was awake, though, and watching the door when she came through it, and his eyes were clear. "Still here," he said. "Still here," she agreed. She sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair, or one like it. The hospital had a limited vocabulary. He looked at her face. He was good at reading faces. She'd always known that about him. It was one of the things she'd been careful about in the first 10 minutes of the trauma room, keeping her face down. "What is it?" She'd thought about how to say it. She'd had 6 hours in a waiting room to think about it, and she still didn't have a version that was clean. Carver found something in the ledger. A 4th name. He was quiet. Someone who's been parallel to Fermi for 15 years. Not subordinate, parallel. Running a separate track with shared funding at the foundation layer. She held his gaze. "Dorian, it's Devereaux." The name sat in the room. Devereaux. The man who had been in the vehicle with him the night he was shot. The man who had taken a graze on the left shoulder. 8 years at the table. The man Rafe had mentioned without suspicion because Devereaux had bled too, had been there, had been present in the vehicle when the attack happened, had been present in the vehicle when the route was transmitted 2 hours before departure. She watched Dorian do it, watched him run it, the route, the timing, Lena in dispatch, who had been brought on by Fermi, and Devereaux, who had known the route because he'd been in the room when it was set and had bled in the vehicle to put himself beyond suspicion. The graze on the left shoulder. A graze. Controlled. Designed. He didn't say anything for a long moment. His right hand was flat on the bed rail, pressing down. "Where is he now?" Dorian said. "Rafe has him. He figured it out 20 minutes after Carver told me. He didn't want to tell you until after the surgery." She paused. "He's been with you 11 years, Rafe. He wanted to be sure before he—" "He's sure." "Yes." The right hand pressed harder on the rail. She could see the effort of keeping his breathing even. The wound, the anesthetic, the cost of holding himself still while something large and old moved through him. 8 years. A man at the table. Another one. "He was in the car," Dorian said. Quiet. The specific quiet of a man saying a thing out loud to hear what it sounds like. "He was bleeding." "Yes." "Controlled bleed." Not a question. Carver confirmed it from the medical record. The angle and depth of the wound aren't consistent with the trajectory of the vehicle attack. Someone with enough knowledge of field injuries could have staged it, his jaw set. He staged being shot to put himself on the wrong side of the suspicion line. Yes. He was quiet again. She let him have it. The full weight of it. The particular grief of being betrayed by someone who had sat at your table for 8 years and bled in your car to look loyal. There was no efficient way through that. You couldn't compress it or process it out of existence. You just had to hold it until it changed shape. She sat with him and didn't try to make it easier. After a while, he said, "Rafe." "He's fine. He's—" She checked her phone. He's in the building. He's been here since 4. Tell him to come in. She sent the text. Rafe appeared in 2 minutes, and she watched the exchange between them. Rafe sitting down in the other chair, no preamble, and the two of them talking in the shorthand of 11 years, efficient and low. The plan for Devereaux's handling, the federal piece, the documentation Carver had flagged that connected the fourth ledger name to the same account structure as Ferme and Vale. Rafe had been thorough. He had the particular thoroughness of a man who was angry and was expressing it through preparation. At one point, Dorian looked at him and said, "You knew before you sent her into that building." Rafe met his eyes. "I knew Ferme had a countermeasure. I didn't know its full scope. I made a judgment call. You should have told me." "Yes," Rafe said, simply, no defense. "I should have." Dorian looked at him for a long moment. "Don't do it again." "No." That was all. 11 years and 2 sentences. She watched it and understood something about the economy of real loyalty, how it included the capacity to be wrong and to say so without performance, and how the man on the receiving end of that could hold the anger and the trust in the same hand without dropping either. Rafe left at 7:30 to handle Devereaux's formal transfer to federal custody. He paused in the doorway, looked at Elena. Something passed between them, not words, not the dramatic version, just the acknowledgement of two people who had both been trying to protect the same man from different angles and had each made imperfect calls in the dark. She nodded. He nodded. He left. She sat with Dorian through the morning. She called Mrs. Farida, who had recovered from her shock of the previous evening and had Noah. He'd been transported to her apartment from the Aldrin property at midnight, asleep, and had apparently woken up and eaten 2 bowls of cereal and asked 3 questions about federal jurisdiction before Mrs. Farida had turned on a nature documentary and he'd gotten distracted by a segment on migratory patterns. Elena stayed on the phone with him for 8 minutes. He asked about Dorian. She said he was in the hospital and that he was going to be okay. Noah was quiet for a moment and then said he'd finished his fraction homework and that he thought he'd gotten them all right this time. "Good," she said. "Mom?" "Yeah." "Is it really over?" She thought about Devereaux in federal custody, about Ferme and Vale processing through an intake system that now had 15 years of financial architecture and a handwritten ledger page that had survived a decade above a refrigerator. About the counter-narrative Ferme had built for 6 months, meeting Carver's thorough 6 hours of work and losing. "Yes," she said. "I think it really is." Noah was quiet for another moment, then, "Okay," and characteristically without transition. "The migratory patterns of Arctic terns are actually incredible. They travel from pole to pole every year. That's 70,000 kilometers. That's a long way," she said. "It's the longest migration of any animal on Earth." A pause. "I looked it up." "Of course you did." "Mrs. Farida's TV has good resolution." She held the phone for a second after he hung up, looking at the middle distance, feeling the specific texture of that conversation, the ordinary shape of him, the way his mind moved, the complete absence in his voice of the kind of damage that could have happened and hadn't. 9 years of careful construction, imperfect and exhausting and sometimes barely functional, and he had come through it curious and clear and intact. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to Dorian's room. He was awake. He'd been given something for pain that had taken the edge off his color, and he looked, if not good, then closer to himself. He was watching the window. The same gray morning she'd watched from outside his room the first time, the city doing its indifferent thing below. She sat down. "He's okay," she said. "Noah?" "I know." Rafe checked in with the detail at Mrs. Farida's. He looked at her. "He asked about me." "He asked about everything." "I know." Something moved through his face. "I have 9 years of questions to answer." "He'll have 9 years worth of them?" "Yes." "I don't know how to do this," he said. Flat, honest, not the performance of vulnerability, the actual kind, the kind that costs something. "I know how to run an organization. I know how to manage threat assessments and financial structures and people who are trying to destroy what I've built. I don't know how to be someone's father. She looked at him. You pressed your hand against his shirt in a warehouse because a man had a gun pointed at you and you wanted to cover him. He was quiet. You learned that already, she said. The rest is practice. He was quiet for a little longer, then, tell me about him. The 9 years. Tell me what I missed. So she did. She started at the beginning. The city she'd gone to when she ran, the apartment she'd found that was affordable and grim, the terror of the first few weeks, and then the particular clarifying effect of necessity, the way survival simplified things down to their essential shape. She told him about finding out she was pregnant 6 weeks after she left, sitting on the edge of a bathtub in a city that didn't know her name, looking at a test result and understanding that the decision she'd thought she'd made for 2 had just become a decision she'd made for 3. She told him about Noah at 2, the single-mindedness of him, the way he'd walked early and talked late and then talked all at once, as if he'd been building vocabulary in private and had decided he had enough to begin. She told him about the library cards in 5 different cities, the way Noah read the way other children watched television, the deep-sea fish book and the fraction worksheets and the Arctic terns. She told him about the birthday questions, each one, the exact words, 9 years of the same patience in a 9-year-old's face, asking about someone he'd never met, as if the answer were simply a matter of the right question being asked at the right time. Dorian listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He lay in the bed with the IV in his arm and the morning coming in the window, and he listened to 9 years of his son's life in the precise telling of a woman who had memorized every detail because she'd understood, somewhere in the back of her mind, that someday she would have to give an account. When she finished, the room was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. I know it doesn't cover it. His voice was controlled and rough simultaneously, the sound of something being said through effort. I stopped looking after 3 years because you gave me every reason to. I know that. I know you built it that way. I know the logic of it. He looked at her. I still stopped. You would have gotten us killed, she said. Quiet. Final. Maybe. Not maybe. She leaned forward slightly. Fairmay had people watching for you to find me. That was the entire structure. If you found me before they were ready to move, we were leverage. Both of us. Noah too. She held his gaze. The 3 years you looked were 3 years they spent building the case that if you found me, you'd find a reason to use me as a reason not to move against them. The moment you stopped looking was the moment we became less useful as hostages. She paused. You stopping looking kept us safe. I know that sounds like... I know it doesn't feel... It feels like I abandoned you. You didn't. Elena, you didn't, she said again, the 2 words carrying the weight of a decision she'd made between the anesthetic and the morning. To say this, to say it clearly and not let him carry a version of it that wasn't accurate. We were both operating on bad information inside a situation designed to make every correct move look wrong. Neither of us abandoned the other. We were managed. He held her gaze for a long moment. I'm not going to let it happen again, he said. I know. I mean... He stopped, started again with the precision of a man who had decided to be exact. I mean all of it. The organization, the way I've been running it, the things I've built, and what they cost and who they cost. He looked at the window. Fairmay spent 15 years hollowing it out from the inside. He used the Empire's infrastructure to build his own. He could do that because the infrastructure was because it was built on the kind of thing that attracts that. He was quiet. I knew that. I've known it for years, and I kept going because I was good at it and because stopping felt like losing. She waited. I'm going to dismantle the parts that can't be made clean, he said. The legitimate operations, there are more of them than most people think. The import structure, the property holdings, 3 manufacturing contracts. Those stay and go clean. The rest gets wound down or handed to the federal process. He looked at her. It'll take time. It'll cost most of what the organization has built, but there's enough in the legitimate side to... He stopped. I'm not asking you to wait for that. I'm not asking you to... You're not asking me anything yet, she said. You're in a hospital bed. I'm aware. Ask me in 6 months, she said, when it's done. When Noah knows who you are, and you know who he is, and I've had time to sleep more than 4 consecutive hours. She looked at him. Ask me then. He looked at her for a long moment. 6 months. At least. Something that was not quite a smile moved at the edge of his mouth. You've gotten harder. I had to. I know. He held her gaze. It looks good on you. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't look away either. 3 days later, Dorian met his son properly for the first time. Not in a hospital room. She'd decided against that, against Noah seeing him in a bed with an IV, against the medical context framing the first real meeting. She waited until Dorian was discharged. Actually discharged, this time, the surgeon's approval, and everything. And she drove Noah to the Aldrin property on a Thursday afternoon when the light was low and gold and the tree line was doing something almost beautiful with it. Noah got out of the car and looked at the house and said, "Is he inside?" "Yes." He looked at her. He'd been processing for 3 days, well, that she'd watched him do it, quietly. The way he processed everything, filing and cross-referencing and arriving at conclusions that he held until he had enough of them to act on. He'd asked 2 questions on the first day, 4 on the second, none on the third. She'd answered all of them as accurately as she could, including the hard ones, including the one about what Dorian's organization was and what that meant, which she'd answered with the particular care of someone trying to give a 9-year-old accurate information without weaponizing it. Noah had been quiet for a while after that one. Then he'd said, "Is he trying to change it?" "Yes," she'd said. "Okay," Noah had said, and had gone back to his book. Now he stood outside the Aldrin property in the Thursday light and looked at the door. "You don't have to have it all figured out," she said. "Neither does he." He nodded. Then he walked up the steps and knocked. Dorian opened the door. He looked better than he had in the hospital. Color returned, the careful posture of someone protecting a healing wound still present, dressed simply, nothing that looked like an effort to perform a version of himself. He looked at Noah. Noah looked at him. "You're taller than I expected," Noah said. Dorian looked at him for a second. "You're exactly as tall as I expected." Noah processed this. "How?" "Your mother told me you were 9. I have a reasonable understanding of 9-year-old height distributions." Noah's eyes narrowed slightly. Not suspiciously, but with the specific evaluative look he used when someone said something interesting. "That's a reasonable answer." "I try." Noah looked past him into the house. "You have a good library. Rafe's man showed me." "I know. He told me you reorganized the fiction section." "It needed it. It was grouped by color, which is aesthetically interesting but functionally useless." "I'll keep that in mind." A pause. The two of them looking at each other in the doorway, gray eyes and gray eyes, the particular charged stillness of a first conversation that both parties understood was also a second conversation, and a 10th conversation, and every conversation they would have to build from this one going forward. Then Noah said, "Can I see the rest of the library?" Dorian stepped back from the door. "It's yours." Noah went in. Dorian watched him go, and she watched Dorian watch him, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the trauma room that she still didn't have a name for. The one that wasn't soft but wasn't its opposite. The one that had no category in the vocabulary he'd built for himself. It was in his face completely, and he wasn't trying to manage it, which was the part that got her, which was the part she had to look away from for a moment. She came up the steps. He held the door for her. "He reorganized the fiction section," Dorian said as she passed him. "He does that," she said. "He reorganized my closet once while I was at work. By fabric weight." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then behind her, she heard a sound. Brief, controlled, and real. He was laughing. Not much, not the open kind. The kind that had been stored somewhere for a long time and had found a small exit. She turned and looked at him, and he had his hand over his mouth, the wound making even that much effort cost something, and his eyes were bright with it. She looked at him. She thought, "There you are." 10 years later, and there you are. She didn't say it. She just looked at him for a second, and then she went inside. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple or the montage version of reconstruction. They were the actual version. Dorian in and out of meetings with lawyers and federal liaisons as the Fairmay prosecution built its case. The organization's unwinding proceeding in the complicated and unglamorous way that unwinding large financial structures actually proceeded, with delays and disputes and assets that took longer to legitimize than expected. He had 2 setbacks with the wound, nothing critical, but enough to require a third procedure and another week where she got the quiet clip texts that meant he was managing something he didn't want to acknowledge managing. She texted back practical things: what to eat, what to avoid. The name of a physiotherapist she knew from the hospital who was excellent and direct and would not let him argue his way out of the exercises. He used the name. She found out because the physiotherapist called her 2 weeks later to say her referral was the most argumentative patient she'd had in 12 years, but that he was doing the exercises. Noah and Dorian found their way toward each other in the incremental, unsentimental way that actual relationships built themselves. Not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, specific things. Dorian started keeping a spare copy of whatever Noah was currently reading because Noah asked questions about them, and Dorian found he wanted to be able to answer. Noah, for his part, started sending him links to articles about marine biology and migration patterns, and once, inexplicably, the structural engineering of 19th century textile factories, with no explanation attached. Dorian responded to each one with 2 or 3 sentences: specific, engaged, never performative, and Noah replied to those, and a correspondence built itself out of that was more honest than most adult conversations Elena had watched conducted in person. In November, 6 weeks after the waterfront, Dorian came to the apartment for dinner. Not the first time. He'd come twice before, both times with the careful positioning of a man who understood he was a guest in a space that had been built without him and who was trying to find the calibration between presence and intrusion. The first time he'd stayed 2 hours. The second, 3. This time he stayed until Noah fell asleep on the couch with a book on his chest and the reading glasses slightly crooked on his nose, and Elena made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she'd sat with the envelope and the kettle 6 weeks ago, and drank it. The cabinet above the refrigerator was empty now. The envelope was in a federal evidence archive. The copy Dorian had, the photographs and the handwritten notes, and page 11 with account 7741, was in the hands of 3 separate federal prosecutors. Done, finished, removed from the architecture of her daily life after 9 years of sitting above the cereal boxes. She felt the absence of it in a way she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling of a weight you've carried so long that when it's gone, your body has to relearn its own balance. He's going to outgrow that couch soon, Dorian said, looking at Noah. He grows about 2 inches a year. I'm tracking it on the doorframe in the hallway. Can I see? She looked at him. Yeah. They went to the hallway. She showed him the marks, 9 of them, 1 per year, the pen lines she'd drawn on the first day of each year with the date written beside them, Noah's handwriting changing as the years progressed, from the deliberate block letters of a 4-year-old to the more assured hand of a 9-year-old who had opinions about organizational systems. Dorian stood in the hallway and looked at 9 years of marks on a doorframe. He didn't say anything. She didn't ask him to. After a while, he put his finger against the most recent mark. Not pressing, just touching. She watched his hand. Next year, she said quietly, you can be here when I make the new one. He looked at her, the gray eyes, the 10 years harder face with the thing in it that had no category. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. The word carrying everything it needed to carry without asking more of itself than it could hold. They went back to the kitchen, drank the rest of the tea. Noah slept on the couch with the book on his chest. The city outside went about its regular midnight business. Sirens somewhere far away, the rumble of something large on the cross street, the ordinary sounds of 8 million lives in motion. 4 months after the waterfront, the Ferme prosecution delivered its first round of charges. Ferme, Vale, Devereaux, and 11 associated parties across 3 criminal and 2 civil jurisdictions. The financial architecture that had taken 15 years to build began its public unwinding in a courthouse downtown. The ledger page with account 7741 entered into evidence and described by the prosecuting attorney as one of the most significant single documents in the case. The counter-narrative Ferme had spent 6 months building collapsed against the weight of what Carver had assembled in 6 hours and what Elena had preserved for 9 years. And the federal contacts who had partially accepted Fairmay's manufactured doubt reversed their positions inside 2 weeks of receiving the full evidentiary package. Marcus Vail cooperated fully. His cooperation was credited and his sentence reflected it, though not enough, Elena thought, to account for 9 years on a doorframe. She said that to Dorian once. He said, "Some numbers don't reduce to sentences." She said she knew. They left it there. Devereaux did not cooperate. He was, in the end, the most complete kind of true believer. A man who had decided what he was going to do and had done it for 8 years with the patience and commitment of someone who had no backup position. He was sentenced in March. Dorian was in the courtroom for it. Elena was not, but she knew from Rafe's text that evening, 3 words, the Rafe economy, that it was done. By spring, the organization's dismantling had progressed far enough that the shape of what was left had become visible. The legitimate operations were substantial, more than Elena had understood when Dorian had first described them in the hospital, larger and more functional than they'd seemed when they existed in the shadow of everything else. 3 manufacturing contracts, the property portfolio, the import structure, which was genuinely and straightforwardly an import structure, and 2 other businesses that had been running clean for years under the cover of something they no longer had to cover for. Dorian put Rafe in charge of the transition management. Rafe, who had 11 years of the full picture and the particular moral intelligence to understand which parts of that picture were salvageable and which weren't, took the role with the same complete lack of drama with which he did everything. He hired lawyers, he hired accountants, he hired the kind of compliance infrastructure that legitimate businesses of that size required. He was thorough. He was also, Elena noticed, sleeping more than he had when she'd first met him. She mentioned it once. He said, "It turns out that managing threat assessments for a criminal empire is more exhausting than managing a legitimate company." She said, "Probably the lack of assassination attempts helps." He said, "Marginally." In April, on a Saturday morning, she met Dorian at the riverfront. Not planned. He'd texted the night before, nothing elaborate, just Saturday morning. "The East Walk, 7 a.m., if you want." She'd responded, "Okay." She hadn't told Noah because she hadn't wanted to make it a thing before she knew what it was. She got there at 7:05. He was already there, standing at the rail where the walk widened above the water, looking out at the river doing its morning thing in the April light, which was the first real spring light after a long winter. Pale gold, not warm yet, but the kind of light that made a promise about warmth. She stood beside him at the rail. They watched the river for a while without talking. Below them, a crew team was running the early practice. 8 oars in the gray water, the cox's voice carrying across the surface in fragments, cadence, and correction. Regular life doing its regular thing. "Rafe says the last of the non-legitimate contracts closes this month," Dorian said. "I know. He told me." "He tells you things." "He's taken to checking in. I think he feels responsible." She paused. He was responsible. He made a judgment call in bad conditions. "Yes." She looked at the river. "He's been making judgment calls for 11 years. Most of them were right." Dorian was quiet. "I'm going to need people who know what they're doing, for the legitimate side. People who understand compliance and regulatory frameworks and who can build systems that don't rely on the other kind of management." "I know. I'm going to need time to figure out what I'm doing." "I know that too." He turned from the river and looked at her. The April light on his face, the 10 years in it, the thing that had no category. "I asked you to wait 6 months." "You did." "It's been 6. She looked at him. She thought about the doorframe in the hallway, the 9 marks and the 10th one coming, and someone to be there when she made it. She thought about Noah sending links about textile factories, and Dorian sending back 3 specific sentences because he'd actually read the article. She thought about the cabinet above the refrigerator and what it felt like to open it now and find only cereal boxes. She thought about being 24 years old in a parking structure making a decision for 2, and 34 years old at an intake desk looking down at a form with a pen she was trying to hide behind, and 34 years old right now standing at a river rail in April light, with everything she'd carried for 10 years finally, at rest somewhere outside her body. "What are you asking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the river, then back at her. I'm asking if you'll let me figure out what I'm doing with you in the room, you and Noah. He paused. I'm not asking for anything that's already decided. I know it's not. I know we have to build it. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking if you want to. She looked at him for a long time. She thought, I spent 9 years being careful with everything, every decision weighed, every risk assessed, every door checked before I walked through it. I built insurance policies and memorized documents and kept envelopes above refrigerators and changed cities 4 times and ran the numbers every morning of my life. She thought, I am so tired of running the numbers. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. Simpler. Just the word, with nothing underneath it but the plain fact of it. Something happened in his face. She watched it happen. The thing that had no category finally found one. It was the expression of a man setting something down after carrying it for a very long time. The specific release of it, not dramatic, not the movie version, just real. Just the actual thing. He reached over and covered her hand on the rail. She turned her hand over and held his. Below them, the crew team turned at the far bank and ran back, the oars cutting the water in time, the cox's voice carrying in fragments across the April morning. And the river went on doing what the river did, indifferent to all of it, the same river it had always been. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, all 3 of them walked the East River front. No bodyguards. Rafe had assessed the threat landscape and made a professional judgment that it had changed sufficiently that Sunday morning walks no longer required visible coverage, though she understood there were probably 2 people somewhere with a sightline, because Rafe did not fully trust the absence of threat, and she had decided she was fine with that. No particular occasion. Noah had asked if they could walk to the far end where the old boat dock was, because he'd read that the dock structure was a 19th century design he wanted to see in person. They walked. The 3 of them in the April light, which had made good on its promise and arrived as actual warmth now, the river bright beside them. Noah walked between them and talked about the dock architecture, and then, without transition, about the migratory route of Arctic terns. And Dorian asked a question about the route that was specific enough that Noah stopped walking to answer it fully. Standing in the middle of the riverfront path with one hand out gesturing the flight path while other walkers went around him. Elena watched Dorian listen to his son explain the route of Arctic terns with his hands. She watched him ask a second question. She watched Noah's face when he answered it. The particular brightness of a child who has been asked a real question by someone who actually wants the real answer. She didn't take a photograph. She just held it, the way you hold something when you understand that the ordinary moment is the actual thing, the thing all the rest of it was in service of. Noah moved on down the path, already transitioning to something else he'd read, and Dorian fell into step beside her, and she felt the warmth of the morning and the river and the specific quiet of a life that had arrived somewhere it had been trying to go for a long time. The most powerful man in the city walked a Sunday path beside the woman who had kept his son for 9 years and listened to that son explain the longest migration on Earth, and none of the 3 of them said anything for a while, and the city went on around them, and the river went with them, and the morning held. He loved her enough to walk away from an empire. She loved him enough to let him think she didn't. 13 years of silence. 13 years of lies, and the truth that finally surfaces will not just break one man's heart, it will burn his entire world to the ground. If you've been waiting for a story about loyalty, sacrifice, and the kind of love that refuses to die,